Well, we'll be having more people join throughout the morning, but hello, everyone. Thank you for spending your morning with us. My name is Joanne Throwe. I'm president of Throwe Environmental, and we, as a team at Throwe Environmental, very pleased to be sharing with you today proposal pro tips and tools for a stronger grant submission. And I've just got to say, we are here on behalf of the sponsorship of National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. They are just an amazing organization. If you haven't worked with them before, it's good that you are here with us. You'll learn more about at least one type of program they have. They have many great programs. So we are thrilled that you are here today. So I'll just say next, Chris, and why don't we go to the next slide? All right. So let's talk about what our morning looks like. First of all, we're going to start with just meeting a few of the team who are here today who will spend the morning with you. And then we're going to talk about key elements of what makes a successful proposal. We're then going to lead into building a proposal, making it really stand out and understanding, from our observation and certainly from NFWF, what it takes to get that first impression and really get their attention. So then you're going to hear back from me later this morning. We're just going to talk about financials, really give you some tips and tools to think through what makes a very solid budget, talking about match and whatnot. We'll give you a little break, very short break, come back at 11. Really talk about what it takes to put those finishing touches, little things that you might overlook, such as getting this submitted, your proofreading, all of that. We're going to do something a little different in this webinar. We're going to do some mock proposal exercises that Kyle will walk us through, and then we're going to adjourn to breakout rooms. And we're really hoping you brought some proposal ideas, but you get time directly with the field liaisons, and you'll be able to ask questions. We can go through very specific ideas you have, and we hope you join us because we're excited about these breakout rooms. So let's go to the next slide. So first of all, I want to talk about the purpose, why we're here. Let's all be clear, times have changed recently, and doesn't matter if you are a seasoned grant writer, which I am sure so many of you are, or this is perhaps your first time at this. We always need a refresher. We always need, what other people use as tips and tricks that make them successful. But more than ever, right now, we are experiencing a very competitive time. As you know, all of you know, grant funding has changed. So we are in a world where we are competing for fewer dollars. That makes us very aware that our proposal has to be really perfect or close to it, and it has to stand out. So what we wanted to do is feature the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. The things you'll hear today will benefit you on so many of your proposals, your grant proposals that you're going after. But what we want to do as field liaisons for the Long Island Sound Futures Fund is really use that as our case study today. So as I went through the schedule, we have 4 informational sessions. We welcome your feedback. Please always put things in the chat. I'm going to introduce the team in a second, but Chris Cortina is really running logistics here, and he's going to monitor the chat, as will some of the speakers, my colleagues. But we're going to do something we haven't tried before, but we've talked about it quite a bit. We've read so many proposals and reviewed them. We're giving you a little mock exercise, proposal exercise. Don't feel intimidated if it doesn't quite work, but we want to point out common mistakes or things you might see or overlook that just draw your attention to. And then again, as I mentioned, we're going to do a little breakout time so you get some one-on-one. We're always here, even after this webinar. We are here for you, as is NFWF, to follow up on any questions and comments you have. But for today, we all know the Zoom etiquette, right? Just raise your hand, unmute to ask your question. Be mindful of how much time you're taking for your individual question. Maybe save very personal, direct, here's my project question for the breakout room. But in general, we really welcome your feedback. We've built in time for good discussion after each session to really break up the slides. So let me quickly introduce the team so you recognize some of the speakers. First of all, representing a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, as all you know, we'll be saying NFWF today. So that's obviously, if you're new to NFWF, it stands for National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We have Victoria Marino. She's a senior coordinator at NFWF, and I have to say, working with Victoria for the last few years, never seen her without a smile. She is just so capable, competent, and I just love working with her. She's so knowledgeable. So she's going to be any questions or comments, she's going to chime in as needed. But we are the Throwe Environmental team, and who is that? Well, I'm in New England. I'm here in Rhode Island, as some of our team are spread out around the country, but we are here as your field liaison for National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, working on Long Island Sound Futures Fund. So we're going to talk a little bit on detail on that. We focus on outreach. We follow up on proposals. So after this webinar, as I said, feel free to reach out to us. We'll give you that contact information. We help troubleshoot. We want to get you to be successful, but keep in mind, just because you're part of this proposal today does not guarantee you will win an award. It's just giving you better tools, right, to apply and give you more knowledge and understanding about various programs. So at Throwe Environmental, we've been working on this for quite a few years now, and we help to create sustainable investment systems. We're looking at funding and financing, and never more important time to think how to pay for projects and develop action plans and strategies than now, right? So we are very much about engaging community leaders like yourself and engaging as many stakeholders as we can. Like I said, we're located in New England, but we also cover the East Coast, and we work nationally for some of our initiatives. And I'm joined by my Chief of Staff today, Kyle Gray. You will hear from him. He's our main facilitator for today. Also, Max Setinari. Max is such an amazing man who is just so capable of running programs at every level and just so knowledgeable. And he is I call him my grant whisperer. Sorry, Max, but he's got all the details on so many national grants and perspectives on the funding and financing. I've already mentioned Chris Cortina. Chris he keeps us on track, running and coordinating behind the scenes, making sure we stay out of trouble. And then we have Sally Ann Sims, and Sally is our technical expert. She is so well versed in technical writing and some of the nuances on nature-based solutions. So we've got a full team, and then you get me. Happy to join you today, but for now, let's go to the next slide. I believe this is when our grant whisperer, Max, we're going to turn it over to you, Max. So again, any questions or comments, feel free to put in the chat, but each of these sections that we have for you today, there will be time for discussion. And with that, Max, I turn it to you.
Thanks, Joanne. Hi, everybody. I hope everyone's having a good morning, and thanks for joining us. I'm going to start today by talking a little bit about first giving a brief overview of the Long Island Sound Futures Fund. It might be some repetition for folks who may have heard some of this before, but just so everyone, starting off on the same footing, going to dive into some details of the program and then touch on key elements of a successful proposal. So the Long Island Sound Futures Fund is administered by NFWF. It was established in 2005, so it's been around for quite some time. And the program aims to support projects that both restore and protect the health and living resources of the Long Island Sound. And federal investment in the program has been strong. Last year, we were around 12 million in federal dollars into the Futures Fund. This year, we're at similar numbers. And that funding is coming from both EPA and the Long Island Sound Study and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Next slide. So the Futures Fund has several priorities for funding that are guided by the Long Island Sound Comprehensive Conservation Management Plan, or CCMP. And the CCMP identifies three overarching themes for Futures Fund funding. And those are clean waters and healthy watersheds. So these are projects that are aiming to improve water quality by reducing nitrogen pollution, working on combined sewer overflows, reducing impervious cover, and addressing stormwater and point sources of pollution. The second theme is thriving habitats and abundant wildlife. So these are projects that are aiming to enhance or restore coastal habitats along the Sound and maintain healthy habitat function. And then there is the third theme, sustainable and resilient communities. So these are projects that are aimed at supporting, informed and engaged communities that use and appreciate and help protect the Sound. So things like public access, cleanups, public stewardship, social media marketing campaigns, etc. And focusing in on this first theme here of clean waters and healthy watersheds, some example projects that are captured under this theme include both plans and implementation of things like green infrastructure, wastewater treatment plant retrofits, riparian and forested buffer enhancements, stream channel reconnections, technical assistance to rural landowners and farmers, addressing agricultural runoff through farm-scale conversion systems, regenerative agriculture practices, and soil health management systems. So a pretty broad range of projects, and these are just examples, but all with the main goal of reducing nitrogen pollution and runoff downstream into the Sound. And so depending on where you are in the Long Island Sound watershed, your eligibility for these three different themes shifts. So the entire watershed is eligible for Theme 1, Clean Waters and Healthy Watersheds. But if you are in Connecticut and New York, in this green area on the map, so non-coastal Connecticut, you're eligible for CCMP Theme 3, Sustainable and Resilient Communities as well. And then coastal Connecticut and New York, shown in red on this map, you're eligible for all three of these themes. So that theme number 2, thriving habitats and abundant wildlife, is only for coastal communities in that red boundary area. So there's 5 different phases of Long Island Sound Futures Fund projects. Applicants are encouraged to pick one of these phases when applying. So the first phase is preliminary community engagement, planning, and prioritization. So the goal of this phase is to come out of your project with a shared set of priorities and activities for your locality, either a region, a watershed, a community, or a specific site. Then moving into phase 2, project site feasibility, suitability, or alternative assessment. The goal here is to to assess specific sites for improved management to address the goals of the CCMP theme that your project will be falling under. Category 3 is project site assessment and preliminary design, with the goal here to come out of your project with 50 to 60% design completed. Then there's phase 4, final design and permitting. So here you would be finishing your project with 90 to 100% design completed and would be starting to, have those permitting conversations and get permit applications submitted. And then phase 5 is actual implementation, so putting your project on the ground. And for design and planning grants, so that would be phase 1 through 4 here. The typical funding range for those projects is $50,000 to $500,000. And then for implementation projects, we see a range of $50,000 to $1.5 million. And for public participation and education projects, so these would only be in Connecticut and New York under that third theme, the funding range is $50,000 to $100,000, even in that implementation phase. So a few other notes here on grant guidelines. Projects are required to start within 6 months of award and be completed 24 months after award for planning and design grants. So that's phase 1 through 4. And large-scale implementation projects get an extra year. So they'll be required to start within 6 months of award and complete within 3 years of that award. And the Futures Fund also has a match requirement. So the match is 50% of the requested amount of your project. And that match is required to be non-federal. And some examples of where that match can come from: in-kind contributions, staff or volunteer time, materials and services, other donations or tangible contributions to the project. And that match can be coming either from the applicant itself or from project partners. And match is required to be deployed throughout the project, so from the start to the end of the project. So now I wanted to touch a little bit on some components of a strong Futures Fund proposal. I'll be a bit brief here because my colleagues are going to go into much more detail on each of these components later on, but just wanted to set the scene here. Some components of a strong proposal: a good, clear title, a descriptive abstract, and proposal description are all key to set the stage for your proposal. The budget and budget narrative. The budget narrative is really important as well. So along with your required budget, in your narrative, you'll want to really explain everything that's going into that budget, especially pieces that might be more confusing than others. So that narrative is really crucial and a great place to really let the reviewer know what's going on in your budget. Metrics and metric notes. So each proposal will be required to meet a set of metrics that are detailed in the RFP. There's a range of eligible metrics that are all laid out in the RFP depending on your theme and your project phase. So along with identifying the metrics that your project will meet, you'll also have an opportunity to add metric notes and describe how your project will achieve those metrics. Match, which we just talked about, so making sure that you're meeting that match requirement, including maps of your project area. And then the proposal narrative. So this has a number of different sections, and this narrative is where you'll really go into detail on your proposed project. But some components of that narrative include the problem and solution that your proposal will address, the technical merit of your application, your qualifications of your organization, describing any community engagement that will be occurring under your project, a detailed work plan, including things like timeline and roles of specific tasks in your project, including any partners of your project, and also talking about how your proposal aligns with the Futures Fund priorities. And lastly, attachments. So this will be where you include letters of support from your project partners and other relevant stakeholders. So lastly, just some key points to remember. Clarity is quite important. So communicating your problem and your proposed solution to reviewers who may know nothing about it. This is really important. Sometimes we see proposals that dive straight away into the technical aspects of their proposal very quickly. And your reviewer might, not be as well versed in the technical aspects of your project. So it's really important to be clear and communicate what your problem and what your solution are to reviewers. Next, aligning your proposal with funder priorities. You really want to make sure that your project is addressing the priorities of, in this case, Futures Fund or any grant that you're applying for, and highlighting the most relevant co-benefits between your proposal and the priorities of the program. Develop compelling narratives. So every project has a story, and you want to be able to sell the reviewer on your story and make that as compelling as possible. And lastly, proofread and copy edit. So you really want to make sure that your proposal is free of mistakes, is clear, concise, and easy for your reviewer to understand. And lastly, just one slide on timeline. So our RFP this cycle came out in March, and the full proposal deadline this year is May 29th by 11:59 Eastern Time. So want to make sure we have our proposals in by then. Review period is throughout the summer and fall, and awards are likely to be announced sometime in November.
Thanks, Max. I think we're going to go into Q&A now, but I took the slides down on purpose, kind of let us see each other and have a short discussion in between sessions. So for folks who are ready to ask questions, you can either raise your hand or you can put them directly in the chat. And then, if you do raise your hand or put it in the chat, you can feel free to come off of mute, ask that verbally, and then have a little bit of a discussion. We'll give folks a minute to think of some questions here.
So just for clarity with the, and Chris with the Grants Land Trust, appreciate you guys doing this. Just for clarity, you mentioned quickly about the matching and the in-kind. If we have partner organizations and they're providing like services, doing education and outreach, that would be like justifiable.
Yes, so that would be able to be included as match, the in-kind services that your partners are providing. Absolutely.
Yeah, and Chris, this is Joanne again. I'm going to go into a little more detail on match in my budget section, so we can take that apart and talk about that further soon.
Awesome, looking forward to it.
One thing I just want to highlight for folks that Max covered was that map that we put on screen. With the 3 different geographies in this program, it is important to just realize, where you fall in those geographies, what is considered coastal and non-coastal in Connecticut, because it's watershed based. So we've had several folks who are a little bit further inland that are actually considered coastal, and they don't really know that. They don't realize that. So there's a map that we can put in the chat shortly to help you pinpoint exactly where you are in the watershed and what the implications of that location, what those are on your proposal and what theme that you can apply for, because that does ultimately decide which theme or themes you're eligible for, and then the type of projects and how much funding. Maybe from the rest of my team, Joanne, Sally, Chris, anything else that Max covered that you feel like it's worth calling out for folks now, knowing what we plan to cover in the next few sessions?
No, as usual, Max did a great job. Victoria, anything to add for Max's section?
No, nothing on my end. Like you said, Max covered everything so well. So yeah.
Thanks.
Right. Well, if there is nothing else here, the Grant Whisperer strikes again. I like that name, Max. I think we're gonna we're gonna stick with that whether you like it or not. I am going to share my screen again, and we will pass it off to Sally, who's going to cover our second session here.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, looking good, Sally.
Okay, great. So we're going to build off of all the elements that Max started, and I am going to move into kind of the heart of the matter with building a proposal that stands out, the power of first impressions, and also pulling that first impression through the whole way so your entire proposal is strong and stands out. So let's start with the title. You want to, as Max had pointed out, you want to make your title clear, descriptive, and as engaging as possible. So here's an example for the Clean Waters and Healthy Watersheds theme, which we're going to be using throughout this particular presentation to choose one theme that we can show examples of throughout, and it's also one that's applicable in all the watershed states. So instead of saying reducing nitrogen sediment loads in the upper Connecticut River through planning, you might want to consider something like supporting water quality improvements and soil health planning on dairy farms in Vermont and New Hampshire. In that case, you've got a lot more description in a very short sentence about what exactly you're doing, who it's benefiting, where it's benefiting, and kind of what this geographic scope is. So you can do a lot with the title just to get the reader more engaged in what you're going to be presenting. And then we'll move on to the project description. This is a very important component because as Max had said at the beginning in his presentation, you wanted to kind of reframe or think about your project with a certain priorities based on what the program goals are. So you want to provide the highest level overview possible to help reviewers quickly understand how the project advances the Futures Fund program priorities and goals. So here we're going to focus on improving water quality and reducing pollution from waters that flow into and the land that surrounds the sound. And this is for upper Connecticut River watershed applicants. So you want to explain how the project will decrease nitrogen, nutrient, and sediment loading downstream and the expected quantification of nitrogen reduction outcomes, and how the project outcomes address the relevant environmental challenges to benefit Long Island Sound. So you can build a case for how what you're doing is benefiting the sound specifically. You also want to refer back to the relevant strategies in the related business plan. In this case, for the Northeast Watersheds Business Plan, restoring the quality of stream and riparian habitat will likely be one of the areas you'll be focusing on in this type of proposal. So this is on reducing polluted runoff from developed and agricultural lands and the alteration of areas that degrade water quality and habitat complexity. And then you're addressing these impairments through some sort of restoration, riparian buffer, improvements in stream habitat, best management practices to reduce runoff, and that will hopefully bolster healthy populations in the river and also expanding available habitat. So here, we're going to kind of put these into a couple of different larger categories. Max talked about the different phases that we basically have. We're improving water quality through nitrogen pollution reduction, combined sewer overflows, impervious cover, stormwater runoff, and point and non-source point loading in Long Island Sound through either an implementation project, which are shovel ready if you're going to go for the implementation project that is going to result in quantifiable pollution prevention. You also want to think about the scale at what you're doing it at, so that it's more than just one farm. There's more impact to it, like it could be a neighborhood, a waterfront, a downtown, some piece of a watershed that's particularly important for pollution reduction outcomes. Or you could do planning activities that lay the groundwork for water quality project implementation. And these include planning and prioritization, and then the different phases of planning, feasibility, suitability, or alternative analyses, site assessment and conceptual design, and then final design and permitting. So you want to be clear about exactly what it is you're presenting to the reviewer. Sometimes if folks haven't thought their project through, they tend to blend categories, and it's a little bit confusing about exactly what folks are asking for. So it's really good to think that through as you're coming up with your project description. Okay, so let's dive into the narrative to sell the project. Max had talked a little bit about writing as if the reviewer knows nothing about the project. So one of the areas is the environmental context that you're setting for your project area, for your watershed, for the sites you're looking at. You don't want to waste a lot of space explaining environmental challenges facing a broader area than you're really focusing on. You can lay out the relevant challenges in your project geography and then move on from there, so that you're not giving away a lot of real estate in your proposal for something that's not directly related to the kind of solutions you're going to be presenting. So after you've established the challenge or the issue of concern in the project geography, you want to present the proposed solution or solutions and how your project advances that solution. Specifically, we're going to deal with the erosion issue in this way. This is how it's going to affect the addressing the pollution problem. Explain how the scale of the solution matches the scale of the problem. Again, this goes back to how are you looking at the watershed and how your particular project is tackling that problem in the context of what else is going on in your geography. And use relevant metrics. We're going to go into detail on the metric part next. So the metrics, as Max mentioned, are all listed in the RFP. You can generally put them in categories of quantifying the outcomes of the nutrient or sediment avoided or reduction, the stormwater prevented from going into the river, the watershed, a number of septic system upgrades, if you're doing that infrastructure focused, best management practices that you're doing across areas, pounds of marine debris removed. And then we're looking into the broader category of miles or areas of square feet that are being restored through erosion control, through riparian habitat restoration, through riverine restoration, floodplain restoration, and you can categorize those depending on what that looks like for that solution. It could be number of trees planted, it could be area of impervious surface removed with nature-based infrastructure or low impact development. And then for the planning metrics, we generally have a number of plans developed through the process would be your metric, but you want to be able to distinguish between potentially ones that are ones for which you have input from multiple stakeholders. You definitely want to call that out for the community engagement relevance for that. And talk about the number of acres assessed for improved management and the number of engineering and design plans developed, if that's part of the scope of what you're doing. And then looking ahead, which is bringing the story forward and talking about, okay, ultimately we're heading towards habitat restoration, potentially in another phase. What is that going to look like that's going to be addressed through the planning that you're doing now? So you can extend the story forward. And then we want to, once we have our project laid out, we want to make sure we're meeting evaluation criteria. These are generally falling into 3 categories: the conservation outcomes, the budget, and the technical. So we want to make sure we're aligning with the program goals and priorities. Have we touched back to the implementation plan actions of the CCMP that we talked about earlier? Do we have a strong nitrogen reduction nexus? That's a really key thing to keep bringing to the fore. If that is one of the main parts of what you're looking at in your addressing in your program. Have we addressed monitoring of activities and outcomes, partnership and community impact, and project long-term sustainability? Potentially, if you have an implementation project, how is that land going to be monitored and cared for going forward to keep the nitrogen reductions working? Budget, Julianne's going to be diving into this in a lot more detail next, but just as a general points to cover would be, are the costs allowable and reasonable, and do they align with NFWF's budget instructions and cost categories? Are the matching contributions at least 50% of the requested amount, and are they non-federal? And does it look cost effective? Does it look reasonable? Does the budget balance performance risk and the efficient use of funds, so that you're doing what's prudent, but you're not doing too much given the scope of what you're doing? And then last is it technically sound and feasible? Is the work plan and the timeline logical for what you're doing? Have you brought in the right folks to look at the technical aspect of it? Do you have accurate spatial data? Are you in compliance with the environmental permitting and QA/QC? All of these will vary depending on exactly what you're doing. Have you had past success doing this kind of work? This would be a chance to make sure that you highlight that. And is the project transferable? And if the project is transferable, if it could serve as a model, if it could serve for some bigger area, have you thought about how that could be done, or how that would look if you're sharing your information? So to recap, we want to, again, create that strong impression at the beginning, starting out with the title and delving into the description and making sure that we're hitting home how we're benefiting Long Island Sound. One thing we haven't talked about a lot till right now is educating the community about the water quality benefits of the project. That's an important component to include, to make sure that there is, knowledge sharing as a result of the project, and describe the resources and approach for long-term maintenance. Again, we want these projects, either the implementation projects or the planning projects that will result in implementation, to have a lasting benefit and to be sound going forward in the future. I think that's it.
Okay, thanks, Ellie. So why don't we open it back up for questions for anything specific to Sally's session here, focused on the project narrative. And like she said, this is really the heart of a proposal. So we're breaking down the proposal into a lot of different components today and doing that intentionally. The project narrative, and you saw this on Max's first slide with kind of all those sub-bullets about what a narrative entails. You've got the problem statement and the proposed solution. So there are a lot of pieces here. But this is really the core of your application. This is where you're selling the reviewers on what you're aiming to do. So Sally did a great job of kind of pulling that apart, showing what the different pieces of the narrative are and why they're important. So why don't we open it up? If folks have questions, they can either put them in the chat, raise their hand, or just come off mute and jump right in.
I think it also is helpful for people to think about those components and be sure that they have them all ahead of time before they start writing. Because I think lots of times folks tend to focus on like kind of the wrong thing, or like Max said before, they just get really technical right up front, and you just want to make sure that everything's in there so you can present the information you want as concisely as you can.
All right, one question in the chat here. Just a basic one. Will the slide deck from this webinar be available? Yes, it will. We'll be sharing the slide deck and the meeting recording after the event.
And shout out to Charles, my former colleague from Antioch. Hello.
Those Antioch roots run deep, Sally. I feel like there's always someone. Good. How about this? I'm interested to hear who on the call has actually applied for this program before. So maybe just a show of either virtual hands, or if you feel like coming on video and raising your hand. But interesting to see who has applied. And maybe that'll get the gears turning here about project narrative, whether that was really difficult for folks to pull together, or if that was maybe the easier part of the application. Lauren, that's one at least.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of related. So I applied last year for a planning grant, and I like the $50,000 for planning for like a single restoration project in a rural area is like sometimes a lot. Because that means like with the match provided, that's like a $75,000 planning effort. And so in last year's application, I actually combined two different projects so I could kind of meet that threshold. So I felt like I had a struggle, and they were both biostabilization projects. So, preventing soil erosion from entering the river. So the themes were the same, but the locations were different and the situations were different. So I struggled a little bit to create like a cohesive story around that. And they were in two different subwatersheds in New Hampshire. So I don't know if you have any like advice or thoughts about that when combining kind of smaller efforts to create the proposal, like what would help make a more cohesive narrative.
Yeah, I've got some thoughts, but Sally, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to hear what Kyle thinks about this, because I haven't seen this yet. But my feeling is like if you could connect it to broader efforts in the area that you're working in, that can start to make a case for having disparate sites make more sense, and also part of a plan to work forward in a region with other partners. That's my first thought.
I'll build off that, Sally. And Lauren, I think this is a really good question. You're not the only person to have this challenge. I think especially as you get further north in the basin, this becomes more common. So I'm really glad you brought this up, because there is that minimum. And then with the match, it becomes big enough. And if you don't feel like you necessarily need all that, now you're kind of pushed into bundling. So like Sally said, I would look at what else is happening across the region, look up and look down. So what's happening, at the local level, what's happening at the state level. Obviously, New England does not have really robust active counties. So you're really looking at, local governments or the state. And then across state lines too. I would think, who are the other actors in this region, governmental or NGO? What are those folks doing? And are there ways to partner to bring in different projects under one umbrella? So I like that as an approach. I think Connecticut River Conservancy as an organization is a good place to be doing this, Lauren, because you're regional in nature and you're based on, watersheds. You're based on crossing state boundaries. So groups like that, I think, are uniquely primed to bring projects together. When it comes to the specifics, it's the connective tissue needs to be there. But I think the program staff and the reviewers understand that, there are times where you need to bundle small projects. So as long as the connection runs back to, nutrient reduction and nutrient loading in the sound, and it's not two totally different projects that have nothing to do with each other, I think there's a case to be made. So don't don't overthink it either. I think, selling it as overall nutrient reduction at multiple different sites, that ultimately benefit downstream. I think that starts to make the case. And as you're starting to write that, if you're running into issues, that's when I would bring it either to our team as field liaisons to help, read it and look at specifics, or bring it to the Futures Fund staff through a proposal lab. And they can actually see what you're working on before you submit and help you kind of flesh that out.
You also could be making a case too for scalability and transferability if you're starting to ship multiple sites, and how that could be done.
Yeah, that's a great point. If it's difficult to connect to other projects, maybe you're at the early stages of what 5 years from now could have really blossomed into something much bigger. So you could say, yes, this is only 2 sites, but over the next several years, we're going to take this project, and the lessons learned on a traveling roadshow across, this region of the state, and, share those lessons learned and disseminate information with other partners. So really good question, Lauren. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you for your help.
Yeah. Did that answer it? Do you have any follow-ups?
It's definitely helpful. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking about my application last year that was not funded. And I think I'm an engineer by training, so I'm very technical focused. So I think definitely opening it up to how we can use this in the future and how to educate people and bring in community groups and plans and stuff like that is good advice. So I'll definitely be using that in round 2 this year.
Awesome. Yeah, it's often matching hard science with soft science, the social sciences with natural, like that. That's typically what tends to make a good proposal, or at least from what I've seen. Kathy, I saw you jumped on camera, and I think you had your hand up before. Anything in particular, any questions or comments?
Yeah, I think Lauren, Charles, and I all work together at Connecticut River Conservancy. And I think one of the things that I feel a little confused about, and it kind of goes back to Lauren's question about scalability, right? Is, as an organization, if you just use the umbrella of nitrogen reduction, we could do one application that's huge, right? Or there may be a way that makes more sense to break it up into chunks. So, we're considering an application around stormwater planning. Lauren does more of the natural resource restoration work. What is your, is there strength in trying to break it up and create some distinction, either by state or by kind of content area, or, BMP area, or phase? Or is it better, do you think, to just lump it and attempt to make this larger connected argument about our work across the watershed?
Yeah, good question. And I'll take the first crack here. There's no right answer. First off, I think it's, there's different ways that you can do this. So there is no single correct approach. But I would think of it as kind of like a Goldilocks, whatever is the just right fit. For context, or maybe just as another example from a different fund, Sally and I a few weeks ago were looking at a proposal that proposed projects across the entire East Coast, from Maine to Florida. That scale's too big. Then, of course, I've seen projects come in that say, this is going to happen at this landowner's driveway. That's a little too localized. So obviously somewhere in the middle there is where we want to live. It's a lot of gray area. I mean, you really can scale up or scale down and still be successful. So it's about building that connective tissue wherever it feels meaningful, Kathy. So I think you suggested a couple ways that you could do that. It could be around the certain best management practice. It could be around a small geography, maybe Southwestern New Hampshire, or the councils of governments and conservation districts in Connecticut in particular are very strong. So maybe clustering around those type of regional geographies. There are different ways to cut it, and I think those are some of them. So it really does come down to project specifics. But I would say best management practice, project outcome, project geography, existing relationships, partnerships that already exist. If there is like a small watershed collaborative, maybe that's the reason that you're grouping several projects together. So it does depend on the specifics, but I don't want you to think there's, it's too rigid or that there's a right answer, because you can come up with different combinations here, and those can be successful. And we've seen a lot of those different proposals be successful. So I know that's not as cut and dry as you might be hoping for, but I think it gives you flexibility. And I would wager one proposal for all nitrogen reduction for the Connecticut River Conservancy, probably too big, but there's definitely ways to think of that.
And there may be kind of landowner type themes as groups that you could think about how to build around that, and then who else is doing work in that area too, depending on how developed those partnerships are for your time frame.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at multiple municipalities. The example that Sally had at the beginning of her presentation that said the mock title that she put forward, improving water quality along dairy farms in Vermont and New Hampshire. That could be one way. You've got a specific type of landowner with a specific set of BNPs. Maybe that's the way you're classifying. So a couple questions in the chat here, and I can move us along. So we've got someone who said, you've mentioned several times to write so reviewers with no knowledge of the topic can understand. What is the role of those reviewers? Sally, do you want this one, or do you want me to take it?
I think I could start, and then you can fill in. So the reviewers are overall looking at all the aspects of what you're writing in the proposal. So they're looking at the technical, the budget, sometimes they're very technical. Sometimes they could be dealing with like this nitrogen reduction. Does this make sense? They could be coming at it from different angles, and there would be multiple eyes looking at the proposal also. So there could be areas of that all of them are not familiar with. So it would just makes it more clear for someone who doesn't have expertise in that particular aspect of all the aspects that go into a proposal to try to just clarify it. And it's not like you're spending a lot of time. It's just like you might want to add a few sentences to talk about why this particular part of maybe changing river precipitation is affecting your project. So do you have anything to add to that, Kyle?
Yeah, I kind of distill it as the reviewer has maybe three main jobs. So the first is the most overarching and the most basic. Does this project fit the biggest umbrella of this program? Is this even a good fit for the program? On a lot of other NFWF programs that have a pre-proposal, that's where that question would really come into play. Can this even move forward to be considered further? So that's the main job here. But since there's only a full proposal for this program, this is all happening at once. So number one, does this fit this program? Number two, is this technically sound? Is everything that the applicant is presenting, is the problem and the proposed solution technically sound? The work plan, the timeline, the applicant who's actually doing it, is all that thought through and technically robust? And then the third one in my mind is, how does this compete across the region, right? It is a competitive program. They get more applications requesting more funding than they have available. So big picture, how does it compete? How does it fit within other projects that have been funded or will be funded in the cycle? Is it ready for prime time? Are there other projects that deliver higher nitrogen reductions or are more cost effective in that kind of class of best management practices? So all of that is on the reviewer's mind. Then after the reviewers score the proposals and they kind of give recommendations to NFWF takes a big picture view and says, this is the slate of proposals that rose to the top. Collectively, does this get the job done? Does this meet the goals of the program and the business plan? And ultimately, that CCNP, the comprehensive management plan that Max started with for the entire Long Island Sound. So it's getting them towards making those decisions.
I think one of the things that we've said before is that if they'll have the ability to do those three things you said, but they might not know exactly that geography. And so, needs to be explained.
Yeah, very true. In the past, NFWF has pulled in outside reviewers. It's a lot of NFWF staff. Sometimes it's some of the funders from the federal level. So it's varying levels of familiarity. So that's the point that we were getting at. Make sure you bring folks up to speed, but do so without spending all of the space that you have in your proposal, getting them familiar with the geography. Couple other questions in the chat here. We see a few more organizations that applied, and I think we're good. All right, so why don't I'll do last call here to see if there are any other questions or comments. We had a few other people said that they applied, so if you want to come off mute and talk about, your experience applying and what that was like with the narrative, that's what this time is for. But if we've exhausted this, we can also move on. So I'll give folks maybe one more chance here if anyone else wants to chime in. Okay, if not, then I'm going to share my screen again. And Joanne, you will be up here to talk
Sorry,
about
could I jump in with a question?
Oh yeah, go ahead,
Sorry
Kate.
about that. So, our project, which is a greenway along the Mamaroneck and Sheldrake rivers in Mamaroneck, so we're right on the Sound. We got a grant last year from Long Island Sound Study for planning and support. And it's going to take it to a point, but we won't have all the permits lined up. We won't have detailed plans. They're doing concept planning, but we're really anxious to move ahead, just because of the pressure that we're under as a community, vis-a-vis flooding and what have you. So where we land is somewhere in between more planning, i.e. the permitting and um, worked out designs and implementation. Is it possible to land in the middle there, or you have to stick to one of the specific buckets?
So I'll get us started here. Big picture, I think what NFWF is looking for is kind of taking this in incremental bite. So that's how they prefer to fund things, Kate. They have seen projects that have come in from, that bundle planning, design, and building all under one application. That hasn't been super efficient. There tend to be a lot of delays. Sometimes it just doesn't get complete. So that's I think why they want folks to segment into different phases. So that's how this program in particular funds things. But if like in your circumstances, say if you did get funded for the planning phase, and now you're ready to just kind of bundle in the rest of the planning and the permitting and the design and do all that at once, and then you want to go construct, there's nothing stopping you from identifying other funding to get that kind of bundle done if the confines of a NFWF grant, just if that's not the right fit. And then you could come in for the implementation and apply for that, as long as you can demonstrate you've checked all those boxes. So with the NFWF programming, yes, they do kind of have these distinct phases, and that's just how they structure things. But if that doesn't work for you, I would say you don't have to fit a square block into a round hole. You can, kind of look elsewhere first and then come back to NFWF and kind of do so strategically, moving in and out of the pipeline, applying for things. So that would be my best big picture strategy to offer. I'm not sure, Sally, if you have anything, or Victoria, if this feels like somewhere you might want to chime in.
Yeah, I think what you said was good. Sometimes it's hard because sometimes those design planning categories are not set in stone. So, are you 90%? Is getting to 95%? How long is that going to take? It's kind of depending on what that means for your particular scope. So, I think that's good. Just look at your timeline in relation to what you have to do and how long you think that's going to take. But it's probably not, you're not going to be able to combine that. You could probably combine some pieces of your planning depending on what kind of scope and how much detail you have. But I think Kyle's suggestion is good in terms of you may want to jump out of the pipeline for a little bit if that isn't going to work.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Victoria, anything to add on that one before we move on?
No, I don't think so. I think you covered it well. I think primarily our focus is just to make sure people aren't biting off more than they can chew and trying to do everything within one project idea. So that's, I think, the primary goal. And your suggestion, I think, is the best approach. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I remember for another NFWF grant that we worked on last year, we saw an applicant who tried to apply for the final bit of permitting and implementation, did not get funded because they were kind of straddling two categories. And I talked to them this year about that application, and the permitting still wasn't even started. So that was essentially a year-long delay. Had they been funded, that would have been a big issue for NFWF. So I think that's them kind of preemptively trying to avoid some of those things. So it doesn't happen all the time, but they've got to be cautious. All right, well, great questions this session. So I'm going to pass it off to Joanne, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about the financial side of things.
Thank you. Well, so I'd like to tell you I put notes together here, slides for the budgets, thinking that you can use a lot of this information for pretty much any grant you're applying for. So, I want you to take it in terms of a budget. We've talked about the narrative, the proposal in and of itself, but the budget is just as important. And I feel that many people focus so much on the proposal and then they're exhausted. They're like, oh, just let's throw a budget together. And I want to caution you from doing that and give you tips here with, an idea of feedback from many funders on things that you can improve when looking at your financials. So next slide. All right, so when we're talking about drafting a grant budget, I always encourage people to start with that work plan. Base your budget directly on the activities. Don't guess where you're going on that activity. Really think about, what is it going to take, exactly what it's going to take to do that activity. We often underestimate, overestimate, but I'm asking you to think about every single resource that you would need to do every specific task. So this really helps to make the budget realistic, and it absolutely aligns with your objectives. So, if you need to start it early, put it aside, revisit it as you're redeveloping your proposal, you're fine-tuning your proposal. Because look, the reviewers they know approximate costs. They've seen so many proposals, they know if it's unrealistic, right? So the next thing is use realistic and well-researched costs. Get quotes. Start calling early and get an idea of, standard rates. What's the salary? What are materials going to cost? Will I need to travel? Those type of things. Don't lowball just to seem cost effective, because NFWF or other grant funders, they don't want that. They want you to be realistic, right? And they want you to be able to do the job adequately. They want you to succeed. So put in what it costs. And if you are finding that, listen, we can't get that particular material, it is not available. But if we do get it, we understand it's going to be so much more by the time this comes out. Well, mention that, put that in, estimate for that. So, I want you to think about including all the relevant costs. Oftentimes, the direct costs, you're not spending enough time thinking through your, all of the supplies or equipment. Can you rent the equipment? Do you have to buy it? That's, different. What is your administrative cost going to be? How much overhead do you need to charge? Include your fringe benefits, your insurance, your, what it takes. Again, justify each line. I think one of the key mistakes people make is, again, they spend so much time on that proposal and it's due any day. And then they put in a budget that's really light on information. Think about it. The funder almost has two types of review: your proposal and then a separate review for your budget. Again, looking if it's realistic. Have you justified each line? So write in the details. Don't make a reviewer guess, right? Many, funders, they require a budget narrative. Use it very clearly to connect the dollars and show the impact, because they'll want to see what that impact is. So matching the funder's format, remember, sometimes people, want to use their own template. That's fine. You put your own template. Oftentimes, you're using an Excel sheet to really map this out. Perfect. But you're still going back and putting everything into the funder, the budget template. You just have to use their format. Make sure you're structuring it like the example. For NFWF, they give you on that first page, they give you an example. Start putting in those details. Don't be light. Stick to the categories. If it's units, whatever level of detail you have, make sure you put it in. Please mute if you're if you can. So next is, think about contingency funds. I know oftentimes we're putting in a proposal based on today's estimate, right? And sometimes, we think, hey, our bills came in, they're a lot higher for this particular project. Well, contingency funds aren't allowed in a budget. They're just not. But if you are uncertain, try to round up. Round up the budget line, not overall, not the total cost, but the budget line that you think, what, there might be a 10% we anticipate for needs or cost fluctuations. So go ahead, it's okay to build that in, rather than have not enough. They don't want you to have not enough, and then all of a sudden you can't complete the project, because there's no going back. These funds get obligated. There's no going back to say, hey, I need another 20,000 more. That's just not going to happen. Next slide, please. So matching fund, and this goes back to Chris's question earlier. I said I'd go into a little more detail. So let's see if I can cover this adequately, and we can go through it a little more in the discussion part of this presentation. But let's make sure, everyone, that you're meeting the match requirement. You're meeting what when we say match, right? It's that contribution, whether it's cash or in kind. The applicant really must bring that complement to the grant. It's important because it is required oftentimes by a funder. So why does a funder require a match? Well, it shows the applicant's commitment, right? They're showing they have skin in the game. It strengthens a project's sustainability, knowing that you've got something invested into this. It also stretches the funder's dollars much further, and that certainly is sometimes a requirement by the funder if, in the case of NFWF, the money from EPA, in our Long Island Sound example, there is a requirement EPA has for match. So there's, match could fluctuate total amount, but you have to think through that they're required, so they pass it on. But it's not impossible. Even the smallest organizations, quite honestly, we've worked around the country and have been very successful at getting matched. They've been pretty creative. So its size shouldn't exactly matter on this, but start being creative with your resources. Start thinking early and strategically about match. Don't wait until, the end of the project. Like, I'm encouraging you to focus on a budget early and throughout your writing process. So I'm also encouraging you to think through match. Don't wait till you're ready to submit. Are you thinking about donated goods? Are you thinking about services? What services might be brought to this project? Chris mentioned volunteer time. So equipment, like, are you borrowing some equipment, or you have some equipment you're using? Really think through, what might come to the table. Have you asked the state potentially for any type of support or other partners? You don't know think through who's benefiting from your project and see if they're able to leverage some of their funds or time towards that match. So failing though to document your match, your in-kind is often it's going to be a problem, or overcommitting to match from an organization. If you've got to be realistic on what you can provide. I know you're meeting the required amount, but try to be realistic because you will have to document this. Documenting and reporting match, it needs your attention. I can't stress enough the importance of good documentation. You should have it behind the scenes. It may not be that NFWF will require all those documents, but in case they ask for everything, you better have those timesheets. You should have what the volunteer work was. You should have donation letters. Put the sign-in sheets out there, financial records, whatever it takes for an approval from people for match. But you should make sure you're covering yourself because match will be verified either in reporting, back to your funder or possibly an audit. I'm going to stick on match for a little bit because I know there will be a lot of questions. Again, match shows buy-in, right? We're showing that all the partners are, they're benefiting, they're contributing. It makes your proposal more competitive. It signals to the funder that there is a broader community investment at play here. I want you to think about how match can leverage partnerships. And I feel in our experience at Throwe Environmental, oftentimes there are partnerships that could be brought to the table here that people are not pursuing. New collaboration on projects is very exciting for the funder to see who's engaged, who's doing what. I also want you to think through, I'll take a moment on this one, accurately valuing staff time and volunteer time. It gets a little fuzzy on some grants on what you're putting in. How do you account for materials and facilities? We're saying don't sell yourself short, but think through volunteer hours and be realistic. So if your valuation on volunteers is a lot higher than what an organization would normally have paid for that labor, it's going to raise questions, right? The reviewer will notice. So think about a baseline of what labor costs would be. Would it be the same for that activity? If it were contracted, is that what you're using? So I'm not telling you not to charge the rate, whatever that rate is, but think about, especially when thinking about volunteer times, what is the estimate you're basing it on? So for example, if your proposal is using outreach and you're using volunteers that are children, young people, youth, you're not going to pay youth, this ridiculous amount per hour, right? So I'm trying to encourage you to be realistic. So what's the minimum wage in your location? You've got to account for that. Again, the reviewer has been doing this a long time. They're going to be skeptical if the online rates, that they would know look very different from the method you're using to calculate. So just, think through it. They're not saying to lowball, they're just saying be realistic and document. So, in projects I've had in the past, it is a matter of sign-in sheets or asking people. Some people, keep in mind on match, some people you might be having 10-year meetings and you want to use that as match, don't assume they can. You have to find out. People often have, perhaps state folks, their time is already committed. So you have to be sure what you're using is the correct match. And, as mentioned earlier, federal versus non-federal sources. Keep in mind, federal is leverage, right? It's always good to write, that the feds might be engaged in your project somehow. Don't forget to say that. That's great information. But federal is not match. It's good to know who's contributing and who's involved and what they bring, but it's not match. So I know you know that, but I'm highlighting that. And remember, a higher budget request means also a higher match requirement. So when you're really thinking through that match, what you have, think about what your total budget ask is. So just a couple more points on matching funds. And I know I'm dwelling on this side a little longer, but I know it's going to come up. So when you're thinking about the main contributions and what's eligible, think about non-federal origin, like I said, what's dedicated to the project, what's the time frame? Funds must be expended within the project's start and end dates. I get questions like this all the time. Hey, last year we had, this project we want to use as match, it's state funds. Well, are you still getting it for this year and you're just starting the grant? No, it's already done. Well, that doesn't make sense to use as match. I know these are things you probably already know, but I have to bring them to your attention. And also, if there's mandatory contributions that maybe a legal settlement of some sort, they are not eligible. And contributions, if you want to know more about matching contributions and matching funds, specifically for NFWF, we certainly can ask Victoria during our discussion, but NFWF in particular aims for a 2-to-1 ratio of matching contributions. And so that's for their federal funds. So, for every federal dollar awarded, they want to raise $2 in matching funds. Think about it like that. I know NFWF's programs vary according to what they require on match, but that is because the funder of where it may come from originally may also vary. So I think I've covered matching funds enough, and I'm sure we'll have a discussion about this shortly, but let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so common mistakes to avoid. Boy, I've got quite a few. When you're talking about the budget, sometimes, we review these proposals and then we look at the budget. And your narrative says you're going to do, for example, 10 workshops. But you look at the budget, and believe me, there's a lot of time spent on budgets to review. And your budget says you're covering 5. That's a red flag. So go through, highlight your proposal. Hey, I need to put that expense and make sure it matches up. So again, like I said at the beginning of this, put your proposal aside. You're going to readjust it as things go along, as you're engaging partners, but make sure they match up in the end. And, vague or very generic descriptions, don't use vagueness. Avoid terms like, oh, and miscellaneous on your budget, and these are all administrative costs. Well, it's fine to have that, but, make sure you're breaking it down. Again, that vagueness will become a flag. So if thinking about your in-kind contributions, if there are contributions coming in and there's a lot of times people are just forgetting about what they should put in. Sometimes I remind people of different avenues to explore and match, and people don't always put that no cost in. They just assume it's there, but think about it. It's an opportunity to look at the in-kind. But when you're doing your budget, let's say on NFWF's form, and some funders might be different, you've got the budget template and then your total ask. Don't add in what you're in your total ask in the budget template. Don't add in that match there. There's a place for match that you're going to cover, but that budget template is not where you're breaking down all the match. So your total ask might look twice as high, and then the reviewer's going, why is this? They're only looking for 100,000, yet it says, 150. So think about arithmetic errors. Most of us are using Excel sheets, something, but you still wouldn't believe how many times people aren't double checking their calculations. So one error in your spreadsheet can really cost you in terms of credibility. And don't ignore reporting or compliance costs. It's okay to add that and budget time in, or the tools you'll need for data collection. People don't realize that that could be part of your budget ask. So if it's evaluation, time for reporting, NFWF is very clear. That's part of this project total, and you can add it in. So let's go to the next slide. I think I've covered most of the common mistakes and helpful guidance. All right, so I tend to use a spreadsheet. Again, our team likes to have it set up with a full spreadsheet to go through, double check, break it out, and then transfer that information to the funders template. It's a lot easier to make adjustments and as you go through it, and it shows you're really thinking through the details of what go in a budget. So it makes you more transparent. You've got the level of detail the funder is looking for. I also encourage you to talk to your finance team, because there's quite a few calls I've had, meetings, if you have one, or somebody who does your invoicing and whatnot. Just check on compliance, check on internal policies, make sure you align your numbers with the funder's requirements. So, don't just keep this to yourself. You've been working on it, you live and breathe it, but remember, you have colleagues for a reason who are experts in this. Engage somebody else to double check your work and your numbers and check on policies. Sally talked about priorities of the funder, and some funders are a little more flexible when it comes to a budget administrative costs. Others expect the money to go directly to program delivery. So I encourage you to know your funder's priorities, and think through examples and templates. I mentioned for NFWF in particular, they give you that first sheet on the budget. They give you an example, but they also are willing to answer questions, as are the field liaisons. So if you're really confused about something, just reach out to any of us and look at successful proposals from other organizations that you may have seen or know of, or it's online. Sometimes funders will, not often, but some grant funders might give you examples to pull from. And luckily today, not necessarily going through a budget, because I'd lose all of you, but we'll definitely go through elements of a proposal, and keep in mind, I'd like you to keep in mind, how does the budget align with that? So leave time for yourself to review. If I can have you take away anything, it's don't do the budget at the last minute. Give time for proofreading, cross-check with the narrative, make sure everything lines up. And let's see, I think I've covered everything on that slide. Let's go to the next one. Long Island Sound budget. Okay, Futures Fund budget considerations. So these are things that I like to encourage you to think about when you're looking at your budget and going through your budget. How cost effective is your project? Remember, NFWF is a value-driven organization. They want to fund projects that really maximize conservation outcomes and, per dollar spent. So keep that in mind. Go ahead and highlight efficient use of your funds. Let's demonstrate that the costs are reasonable, relative to the benefits that are being delivered. So, boy, this cost per acre restored and cost per species protected or cost per volunteer trained, they want to know you're using their dollars efficiently and effectively. So remember, your details to prove that are important. And so my tip again on thinking through your budget, is leverage those partnerships. I mentioned it for match, but really try to stretch the project dollars by showing it's so cost effective because you've got these volunteers involved and whatnot. So another point here, bullet on this slide is, what is the overall return on investment, the ROI, right? NFWF wants to spend their dollars as effectively as possible, like I said. Remember, an ROI isn't just financial. And Kyle mentioned this earlier with Sally. It's ecological, it's social, right? So always keep that in mind. Frame it in terms of the impact. How much shoreline is being restored? How many pounds of nitrogen reduced? How much the community's engaged? Things like that. So frame it in terms of that impact. NFWF's priority is to fund projects that produce measurable conservation gains. We all want that. But that aligns with the Long Island Sound Future Fund goals. So it has to be done, though, at a reasonable cost. There's, like I said when I did the introduction, there's fewer grant dollars out there now and more people chasing what dollars are left. And, these things are going to make the difference between a funded proposal and a not funded proposal when the competition's so tight. So I want to offer, an example just to drive these points home. If there are two projects, right, both being maybe 250,000, but one restores 5 acres and another restores 15 acres, right? NFWF is going to review that and they're going to look at the higher impact per dollar, but all else being equal. So I'm not saying that there might be things about the 15 acres that don't work, as we've talked about in previous sessions, but don't give up if you've got, but you don't know your competition. So I want you to keep in mind they're looking for return on investment, as would any funder. So how does your project compare to others in the region? There was an Oregon proposal on another fund, and I went back to them and I said, where's this budget coming from? Why are these numbers so much higher than anything else we've talked about or that is coming through? And they explained a very specific issue with that region getting supplies and what happened after COVID. And it was perfectly good explanation. They didn't say a word of that in the budget narrative, right? Or in their proposal. So these very high costs with no explanation. Of course, that's going to raise flags. So try to compare costs with nearby projects if you can. That just, if it comes in higher, that's okay. It's what it costs, but just do your homework. And, think about sometimes people they try to give you this minimum or maximum range on your total budget, right, for your project. Ask yourself, am I within that range? There's a reason they give you a range. So try to stay there in that range. You'd be surprised how many people do not. So if your costs seem high, my takeaway is explain. Explain why. It's okay, like I said, but you need to explain. And maybe you are dealing with contaminated soil. Maybe your permitting costs are so much higher in your particular area. Maybe you have this very, very complex stakeholder engagement. Whatever it is, use your words to explain why. And you've got enough room in the narrative to do that, the budget narrative. I'm keeping track of my time, but I've got more to share with you. So indulge me on this slide just a minute longer. So I just want to talk about another couple tips here. So do you know what your research costs are for similar proposals, perhaps in the Long Island Sound region? Can you reference that data in your proposal? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. Don't worry if you can't, but just think about that if you've got the research cost to document it. And also in sizes, for different project categories, pay attention, like I said, to those minimum and maximum funding sizes and align your ask with what's typical. Avoid extremes. Unless you could really justify it, projects that are way above or below the norms are going to raise flags. So I'm trying to keep things in your mind when dealing with the budget. And, the takeaways certainly from this slide would be, remember, realistic, defensible budgets win grants. I'm not guaranteeing anything, but, it's realistic. The budget matters so much. Match matters and credibility on that match, whether it's cash or in kind. Make a cost-effective story out of this. And your budget narrative matters too. It's not just about the numbers, it's the why behind the structure of your costs, how you've structured your costs. And that's really important. So, let's see. I could just go through, is there another slide? I've got a few more tips to add, but can you advance? Is there a next slide? Yeah, okay. So I just want you to pay attention to the budget categories here. You all know them. They're very important. You need to think about your detailed budget, your narratives. You need to make sure you're in compliance with, uniform guidance, but these are your categories. And remember, you can put in time for your QAPs, community engagement, account for all those miscellaneous, but don't just say miscellaneous, add it in, know what it is. Salary and benefits. Sometimes you need to get personnel to provide project management. Oftentimes people running through their budgets forget you can add that in. Somebody's managing your project for you. NFWF understands that. They're not looking for you to just not assume that is a direct, cost. So add it in, but break it down. Equipment. What can I say about equipment? List anything you think is necessary for the project. Contractual services, detail services. What are you procuring from third parties? Supplies and materials. Itemize all the necessary supplies and materials. And travel. Will you need a trip or expenses? We all know that we've got to be realistic. What's the purpose? Sometimes people put in a travel budget, but they're not putting in any destination or what the purpose is. And when it comes to those other direct costs, include costs that don't necessarily, they don't fit in the above categories. There's not a specific line there. for those bullets, but they are absolutely directly related to the project. And indirect costs, NFWF has an indirect cost calculator on their website, but use realistic what is allowed and what is appropriate for you. So let me just wrap up. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so let me just wrap up before I think we're going to take a break, but before we do, I'll open up to questions. I have a feeling there'll be a few, but so let me just wrap up with a few words to take away here as additional tips. First of all, I want to mention consistency. I've been saying ensure your budget aligns with the activities and objectives outlined in your proposal narrative. This is just the first most important tip. Accuracy, double check your calculations and ensure that your figures are correct. Documentation, I talked about documentation. Be prepared to provide those supporting documents or quotes, estimates that you might have for budgeted items. No guessing. There's no guessing here when you're developing the budget. Make it based on something. And of course, it's very important for communication. If you have questions, you need clarification. Don't be shy. This is what Victoria and her colleagues are there for. This is why they've hired field liaisons. So we're here to communicate and offer help. That's what our job is. And, I know we're going to talk a little bit about uploading the easy grant process, but my takeaway on that, don't wait to the last minute. Kind of work with it, save your work, especially as it relates to the budget items. Make sure you're filling out anything that has an asterisk. Make sure it's completed. And of course, when you're uploading everything, there's always a help feature for NFWF. So if you're not calling us, there's also a helpline. Those are my takeaways, and I hope this was useful for you and that you could apply some of this information to other grants you might be considering. So with that, Kyle, let's open it up and see how many questions are out there.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. You've done your fair share of budgets, so these are all helpful tips, and I think it's firsthand experience. So we've got one in the chat that I can start us with, but as we go through this one, folks, feel free to put more questions in the chat or raise hands, come off mute, and we can always start teeing them up. But the first one here is from Kelly, and she's saying, when you're suggesting we compare our project's budget with the costs of a similar project in the region, are you recommending we include the comparison project in our proposal, even briefly?
No, I don't think that is needing to be done, but I do think it makes you find out whether you're realistic. And quite honestly, you also know who the competition might be, and if you're well within your ask. And we're talking about budgets here. People are pretty good about wanting to share that information. Maybe not with salaries, but it doesn't hurt if you have a relationship with another organization. But you don't need to include that. You could just say this compares within the region to cost, something like that.
Yeah. Kelly, if I could just add on to that, I think I agree with everything Joanne said. If you find that the project's going to the high end of a range, and for the Futures Fund, you have to stop at the maximum. It's a hard max. But if there's a suggested range and you're going over what the suggested is, and it's higher than you had ideally want, if it's a project that your organization has done before, and you say, this is just realistically, this is what it costs, we're keeping costs as low as possible, and even still it's over the max, maybe then you mention, we've done this before, we've gotten funded before, especially if it's by NFWF. You could say, we've gone through this, here's an example. But otherwise, yeah, like Joanne said, I think, it's more to inform you on the back end.
Yeah, that's right. Great advice, Kyle, as always. Thanks, Kelly, for your question.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions, comments from folks? Maybe the part that folks get wrapped around the axle the most.
Yeah, I probably spent a little more time on it, but we do get a lot of budget questions, and it really is applicable to other grants out there.
Yeah. Sally, did you have something?
Yeah, I had a question that I think maybe a question that folks might have is if they put in a proposal, NFWF really likes what they're doing. It's a really good fit, and there's some issue with the budget that is questionable. Is there any outreach potential back to the client? Well, I mean, to the applicant while they're in the process of reviewing, for which they could clarify if there's some issue with the budget?
That's a great question, Sally. So are you suggesting that NFWF would say we're confused on your budget detail on, on one aspect of it, and can you fix it
Or
or
can you
explain
explain
it?
it, or can you explain as to why we feel this is
Yeah.
unusual?
So I'm going to give my answer, and then I see Victoria put her camera on, and then I'll let her completely disregard anything I said. But listen, I want to tell you, if you've missed a detail or you've not put enough, there's a lot of applications out there they're reviewing. If they went back to every single one, ooh, make this adjustment or do this, and you'd be more competitive, that puts you at an advantage and others at a disadvantage. So my feedback on that question is get it right. I'm trying to drill home to everyone that the time you invest in creating a budget matters, so that won't happen. And it doesn't leave for any confusion because they don't have time to go back to how many applicants and make adjustments. Victoria, did I get that right or what?
Yeah, no, that's correct, Joanne. Yeah, it's making sure that you get it right with this submission because there may be some rare exceptional occasion where we might reach out to folks about a specific programmatic question that we and the reviewers may have, but that's a very rare case. Oftentimes what you present with your first submission, that is what we're seeing and reviewing on. Yeah, because obviously we want to ensure that there's fairness for all the other applicants as well. So if we're reaching out and giving other people chances to revise something or reiterate or elaborate on something, it's not fair to everyone else. So, yeah.
But Victoria, on the other end of this, let's say they get awarded and there's a little clarification that compliance, needs or the budget office needs, then they can ask because you've already been awarded, correct?
Mhm. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, once an applicant were to receive that conditional award notification, yes, those are those moments where we would then follow up from the programmatic standpoint, from the compliance and budget standpoint. Yeah.
Okay. But Sally,
And
that
I,
was a great question.
yeah,
Yeah.
really good question, Sally. I want to build off that too, because if something does get declined because of a cost argument or a match argument, it's not the end of the world. Obviously, it's disappointing, it's frustrating, it can throw a wrench in your plans for a project. But the grant cycle is every year. And by the time they are announcing awards, it's typically November or December, as you saw on Max's timeline earlier. The grant application opens back up in March usually. So we're only a few months away from reapplication by the time you would be notified. So I just want to remind folks that yes, it's frustrating if and when you're not awarded for something. And if the budget or a small change is something that stopped you from being awarded, or at least in part it was. But the cycle does repeat itself every year. That comes around pretty quickly. And I think one of the best things about the NFWF programming is that they're really good with giving feedback on declined applications. Really, all you have to do is ask. When you get that feedback, it's super informative. As field liaisons, we're here to help you, work through that if any of it's confusing. And we do that with dozens of applicants every year. So if you're seeing those comments, you're not sure, we help you work through it. You've got some really valuable information on your particular project to apply for the second year. And there's no statistics on this, but the level of success does go up upon reapplication. Those folks are more successful. So, don't let it be a total downer if you don't get funded the first time, because there's enough, high quality information afterwards, including on budget and match, that could position you for success, or at least, a better chance of success within just a few short months.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm going to build on that again. And I would say what surprises me, often people won't bother to follow up about their proposal. Any proposal you have done, get the feedback. I'm not talking about just NFWF. If you apply to, you spend all this time, and we all know grant writing, putting budgets together, it takes time. Get the feedback because you don't know how close you were, perhaps, from getting funded. But if you don't inquire, you might be able to recycle that proposal for some other opportunity. But I have done, Kyle, how many have we done conversations with people like, listen, here's where it fell
Hundreds, yeah.
short, right? And it's, that is very useful information. Don't just discard your project. Just think, I have something here. This is really important to our community. Let's figure out how to fix this. So reach out to your funder or your field liaison, ask for feedback, and then either rework it, or they might say, listen, this is not an appropriate project for this particular fund, but there might be others. So I just want to mention that I find so many people do not inquire for feedback, and perhaps the funder won't give you it, but NFWF's great about that. So
Yeah. I want to keep us close on time here. One last question that I can just answer quickly, and then we can take a break. Do the upper and lower limits, I should say, do they include the match? They do not. That's the upper and lower limit. That's the request amount. For the Futures Fund in particular, it's a 50% match requirement. So if you're going up to that limit, then 50% of what you're requesting is what you're required to provide for match, but that does not include the match. So we're doing pretty good on time here. What we're going to do is take a short break, and then we'll come back and discuss some final touches on the proposals. That will be kind of our last session when we're delivering content. And then after that, we've got our mock proposal exercise, and then we'll go into breakout rooms to finish off the whole workshop. So we're going to take a break. Everybody is off video and on mute anyway, so we're in good shape there. So stay how you are. You don't need to leave the Zoom. We'll just let you know when it's time to start again. And we are going to get back together in a little over 10 minutes or so. We'll aim for between 11 and 11:05. So we will see folks then. A second so we don't forget. Awesome, thank you. Give it another minute or two, just since we went on break a couple minutes late as well. But as we wait for folks to get back to the computer, I'll just see if anyone has any questions, comments, or anything on any of the content we've covered so far. We'll have plenty more opportunities to discuss, but while we wait a few minutes, if there's anything folks want to bring up now, it's a good time.
Just throwing out a crazy idea. In other grant proposals, they also like limit the amount of indirect that we're allowed to charge. But sometimes like we have a NICRA rate that's larger than that, and they allow us to use that difference as match. Is that something that's allowed in Long Island Sound?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know that's not the first time we've gotten that. Joanne, I don't recall the answer on that. I might need to tap Victoria in for that one as well.
Yeah, boy, that's definitely a gray area, and I want to, when Victoria's back, I think we definitely need to ask her that one. That's a very good question.
Yeah.
I know it's hit or miss. Some do, some don't. So but it can be a nice little chunk of change if people are looking for some match funds.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll Lauren, let's Victoria, let's give her a moment and we'll get you that answer.
Okay, thanks. And also just to plug, I've had a lot of success working with engineering firms and asking them to give us a nonprofit rate. So they'll do some in-kind match funds
Oh, that's
there
terrific.
as well.
Yeah, and that difference can definitely be matched. That's great.
Okay, Victoria, you're back. And Lauren, do you want to ask your question again?
Sure. Yeah. So in the Long Island Sound Futures Fund, you have that really nice little spreadsheet that allows it calculates the indirect that you're allowed to put in your proposal. But sometimes we have NICRA rates that allow for more, like in a general sense. Sometimes grant programs allow us to use that difference that isn't covered as match. Is that something that we can do in Long Island Sound Futures Fund?
Yeah, so actually, that is a question for our compliance department because that's actually something that's actually being kind of reassessed over here on our end. So I can definitely follow up with you with the answer to that question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
helpful.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, sorry, I can't give you the answer right now, but I can definitely for sure follow up and give it to you.
No, it's a great question, Victoria, and very useful for our participants to find out because Kyle and I stayed clear. We didn't want to answer that one wrong.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah. It's a good question when it has to get passed along a couple different times. So I think it's a good sign that it's being reassessed. That should be a good thing. So great. Well, we will get back to everyone with the answer on that. And since it's 11:04, I think we can get started here. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me actually move this around so I'm not looking up the entire time here. All right, perfect. So as long as folks can still see the slides here, this next session is going to be focused on the final touches of a proposal. So we already talked about the overarching, big picture, what a proposal and what this program looks like. We talked about the project narrative. We talked about match. So we've covered some of the really bulky sections of an application. Now what we're doing is talking about the final touches, kind of the last things that you're looking at before you click submit and how those might make a difference for you as an applicant in your success rate. So the final touches do matter. I want to caveat this by saying they obviously don't matter as much as a really solid project narrative or a cost-effective budget. That's just the case. But these simple pieces, these simple final touches do matter. They do throw signals out there for your reviewers. And if they're simple errors, they do have the opportunity to maybe even hurt your chances of getting funded. So these are pieces that don't require a lot of work when it comes to going through a proposal with a fine-tooth comb. And it likely is worth the time that you're going to spend on it because it will help to maximize the impact of your proposal. It'll help you stand out to reviewers who are looking at potentially dozens of proposals during a single cycle. And again, it will help at least not harm your chances with just some basic errors that really can be avoided if you're going through it carefully. We were talking about this with the folks at NFWF the other day as we were preparing for this workshop, and they agreed that reviewers do notice these small errors, and we'll talk about what exactly those look like, what some red flags might be. But small errors can signal rushed work, it can signal carelessness, or even a lack of capacity, which is the exact opposite of what you want to be conveying to a reviewer who you are trying to convince, that you do have this capacity and you have staff capacity, experience, qualifications to take on a large NFWF grant that's largely funded by federal dollars. That's a lot to convey to someone. So then when typos or spelling errors or formatting issues, when things like that get in the way, it's really unnecessary and it does have the potential to harm your competitiveness. So the readability of a proposal will show that you took your time, you did your due diligence, you put the effort in. And again, it won't help you. It'll prevent you from standing out for the wrong reasons. And that's really what we're looking for here. So some things to look at here. We kind of got a little checklist to help you quality control the projects that you're putting forward. So thinking back to everything we've already discussed in terms of content, you want to ask yourself, does the project that you're putting forward, does your proposal align clearly with the priorities of the program that you're applying to? In this case, we're still using the Futures Fund example. So are you lining up with the Clean Waters and Healthy Watersheds theme that we talked about? That's focused on nitrogen reduction and nutrient reduction. Are you aligning with program priorities? Are you using nature-based solutions? Are you linking back to the Long Island Sound? The big picture items that this program is all about. Does your proposal really fit within those priorities? If you're having a hard time answering that question, that may mean that you need to do some reframing to make sure that the reviewers can clearly see that alignment. You don't want that to be a question at all for them. Very quickly when they review, and we talked about the first look that Sally mentioned earlier, they're looking at the title, the abstract, the description, even the project problem and the proposed solution. Do all of those line up with what they might expect to see in this program? You want that answer to be a resounding yes. If it's not, that could be cause for concern. Another question is whether or not you've reviewed or self-evaluated the proposal using the evaluation criteria that are provided in the RFP, the request for proposals. So at the end of that document, way down at the bottom, you'll see a table and it tells you the evaluation criteria. So these are the criteria that reviewers will be using to evaluate your proposal, just as it says. So they've got a checklist of different bullets, and as they're reviewing, they'll be asking themselves, is this project technically meritorious? Does this project operate cost effectively? Does this project engage the community? Are they, engaging partners? Is the proposed project team, is it technically robust? Are they experienced? So again, you can look at that table and start to evaluate yourself. And if you feel like you would score highly on those bullets, that's great. If you're having trouble confidently saying, yes, I meet that requirement, that might be somewhere to flag for yourself to pay more attention. And then, of course, you want to look through and decide, have you addressed any potential red flags that might come up for your reviewer? Remember, these reviewers are coming from a lot of different backgrounds. Some are NFWF staff, some are federal, some are outside of the NFWF and federal world, and they might be working at NGOs, and they're being brought in as technical reviewers who are volunteering their time to support NFWF proposal review. So the level of knowledge is going to differ. They'll all have a certain level of knowledge and technical skill, and that's why they're brought in. But they may work on the North Shore of Long Island, and they may not have a lot of experience in Northern New Hampshire or Northern Vermont, or vice versa. So if that's the case, you want to establish things early. You want to explain to them anything that they may not understand inherently. But again, do that wisely and don't use too much space doing that. So big picture, you want to use the RFP, you want to use the evaluation criteria and the metrics, all to help guide your own self-assessment of what you've put together. One thing that I do want to flag here, and that's why we've got it in blue at the bottom, is that if you already have an active grant with NFWF, what you want to do is make sure that all of your reports that you're required to submit as a NFWF grantee are in. Everything is submitted, it's on time, there's nothing outstanding. And that is really, something that you're not gonna get a demerit or anything because of that, right? They're not holding you back from getting another grant because a report is overdue. But what that could do is signal, again, in a negative way, that maybe you don't have the capacity to handle another grant. If reports are outstanding, you're several months behind on submitting reports in easy grants, that could flag for reviewers and NFWF staff that maybe this applicant, they're just not ready for a second or even a third NFWF grant right now, because they are hefty and there are pieces to manage after the fact. So these are all things that you want to consider as you're submitting, again, to avoid setting the wrong tone with the reviewers and with NFWF staff as they're deciding who gets funded in any given grant cycle. So some specific red flags to talk about here that have the potential to cause reviewer confusion. I want to highlight a couple of these. And these and all of the content that we've talked about so far will come up in the next session where we go through that mock proposal. So I kind of split these up in the theme of too much and too little. On the too much side, some red flags would be too much technical jargon or too many buzzwords. So if you're going through and you're writing your proposal narrative and you're pulling out the thesaurus and listing out every buzzword in the field, that's going to be a lot for reviewers to read and digest. They're going to have a hard time really understanding what the project is and what it does. So avoid overcomplicating it with buzzwords, avoid getting too technical, especially, I said reviewers all have this certain baseline technical skill, but you don't want to get too much in the weeds. So really balance that and make sure that you're explaining what the project is without really focusing and zeroing in on one piece too much, so that they're having a hard time understanding the big picture here, right? You don't want to lose the forest for the trees. Next here is providing too much background. So again, it is important to talk about the specific conditions on the ground in the geography that you're working in, right? If you're working in Hartford, Connecticut, you do want to talk about the environmental challenges in Hartford and how that impacts Long Island Sound in your project. What you don't want to do is start talking about all of the environmental challenges facing the globe in North America and the United States and the East Coast and New England and the state of Connecticut and then Hartford. That's way too much background detail. We have seen that multiple times over. There will be people who explain, environmental pollution or, climate challenges, and they'll start really high and then spend paragraph after paragraph narrowing in. It's a waste of space. You can assume the reviewers have a good understanding of environmental challenges globally, and even in New England, I would really stay, at the local and maybe state level, to get a good understanding of specific project details, but don't go into the territory of providing overkill. In the same vein, we've seen folks attach, city comp plans, hazard mitigation plans, coastal resilience plans, plan after plan as appendices on their application, and the proposal itself will be the 8 pages that you're limited to. And then the attachments will be 550 pages. And it's an entire community comprehensive plan. If you feel like it's very necessary to provide links to those documents, I would recommend hyperlinking them, putting the URL in the proposal narrative, and not including, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of pages of attachments. It's just not necessary. It is overkill. That's not necessarily going to harm your score, but it is just far too much information for reviewers to handle. And if they're receiving several proposals over like that, it's going to drain them. It's a lot of information, and you want to convey what you're doing in the tightest, most concise amount of time as possible, so that they'll score your proposal favorably. Another thing you don't want to do is put too many bells and whistles on the template. NFWF, over the past few years, has put together this proposal narrative template for applicants. And I have been very, very firm on this. I think this is one of the best things that they've done for applicants. You've got a template that's put together. There are specific questions that they want you to respond to. It's not a blank check. They tell you how they want to see responses. And all you have to do is answer their questions and respond accordingly. You really don't need to overthink it beyond that. What you should not be doing is jazzing it up too much. Italics, crazy font colors, changing the formatting. This isn't something that it won't be the detriment of your proposal, but it can really cause confusion and visually cause your proposal to stand out for the wrong reason if you're writing it in bright red Comic Sans that's italic throughout the whole thing. It gets to be confusing and kind of overwhelming to read. So that's the last thing that you want folks to think while they're reviewing your proposal. On the flip side of the coin, you don't want to provide too little. So if you have project partners and municipalities and community-based organizations that you're engaging, don't forget you need those letters of support. We already talked about how important letters of support and match are to show buy-in from different partners. So don't forget to include those attachments at the end. That is a good use of appendices and attachment space. In the same vein, you don't want match sources or budget items that are unclear. Don't provide too little detail on those sources to leave folks confused as to why they're there or what they're for. So if you have staff that's being brought in, if you're contracting, if you have equipment, or plans, or materials, talk about why those are there in the budget narrative, match narrative, in the proposal. Even in the letters of support, if you're bringing in project partners, you can kind of hit that point several times over. If the project partner is your local Audubon chapter and they're providing match, they're a project partner, and there's a letter of support, you can reiterate their involvement multiple times over throughout the project. So that really helps to make it a more comprehensive picture. And lastly on this slide, don't provide too little on project outcomes. You want to be specific on what you hope to achieve. For this program, under the theme of clean water and healthy watersheds, you want that to be specific nitrogen and nutrient reductions. So you do want to get granular with project outcomes. Again, you don't want to get granular on the areas in the first half of this slide where you're providing too much detail. But here on project outcomes, you do want to provide specific information about what you hope to achieve on the project. And that's what those metrics that NFWF puts forward are for. They're meant to draw out that information and those details from your project. Next here are just some really basic copy editing tips, but it comes up in every single proposal. There's always a typo that happens to everybody. This happens in newspapers and books, so it's something that you can't avoid entirely. But repeat errors here are going to be, again, something that stand out for the wrong reasons. So use a second pair of eyes to help check for grammar, spelling, tone, and flow. If you're like me, when you write these things, I write any type of proposal, start to finish, and I really get in the weeds on it. And by the time I'm done, I think it's, I did it intentionally. I have a full proposal. I feel good about it. But you definitely have gotten in the weeds and maybe a little too much on the proposal. And now you need those fresh eyes to take a look at it, help to identify where the flow is just not clear, maybe where you've lost the tone or the formatting a little bit, and where there might be basic spelling or grammatical errors. So definitely just have someone else take a look at it. It doesn't necessarily need to be for content, but that copy editing, that view can be really, really helpful. Formatting, again, we talked about this earlier, the NFWF proposal gives you a lot of this with the headers and the spacing and the bullets. So don't overthink it. They give you instructions. It has to be a maximum of 8 pages, minimum of 11-point font. You need to keep the 1-inch margins, and you should not delete the NFWF instructions from the proposal. So in the past, these instructions were really, really lengthy, and they said, go ahead and remove them. They've updated that over the past year or so. And those instructions are much more concise, but they do want them to stay in the actual template and what you submit. So don't remove them, leave it as is. Really, all you should be adjusting are your responses to each question. One thing I did want to talk about here that is maybe newer for this year is the use of digital tools. And obviously spell check is something everybody's familiar with, but maybe even artificial intelligence or AI as a way to help cross-check your proposal. Of course, you want to do so wisely, take it with a grain of salt and critically, really make sure that what you're getting out of an AI software is beneficial to you, is not confusing any details or making things untruthful. Again, with a grain of salt, take that critically and decide for yourself whether or not you feel it's active. But if you're interested in this, what you could do, just as one example, is to upload your proposal in the request for proposals from the program that you're applying to into the AI software and say give it a prompt along the lines of, I'm applying for this proposal. I need you to help me decide, am I meeting the program requirements? Or how would you score my proposal? Is it competitive? Are there areas for improvement? Are there places where I don't have enough detail or I'm not being clear enough? Or maybe I can be more concise. Do I align with the program priorities? Do you feel like this fits the program? How could I reframe things to fit the program better? So these are all prompts that you could consider using for an AI software. ChatGPT is what our team uses quite often, Gemini, but there are several of them out there right now. Use it with a grain of salt again, but think through and get some feedback from a platform like this that will highlight areas that you maybe could work on a little bit more. And then, of course, take what you've got and think critically. If you decide ultimately it's just not useful, then move right along. But maybe it is, and maybe it highlights some spots where you can spend a little bit more time. We talked briefly about letters of support, so I just want to build on this a little bit. The purpose of a letter of support is actually multifold. You want to demonstrate buy-in from whomever the letter is from. It'll help you demonstrate partnerships, formally with your project partners. A letter of support is a way to engage landowners, specifically those where the project is happening on their land, but maybe they're not super involved with the project. And you can use them very strategically as a place to dispel any concerns. So I'm going to use an example out of Texas from another program a few years ago. The applicant submitted a proposal for a NFWF grant. They did not get funded. We were talking about, areas for improvement between cycles, and they were hoping to reapply. And one comment that they got, because they were aiming to develop a community plan, the reviewers said, well, isn't it duplicative of what's happening at the state level? We really don't need another plan. So maybe this isn't as necessary. Maybe you should just talk to the state as opposed to NFWF funding a brand new plan for $250,000. And after I talked to the applicants, they said that is not the case at all. Yes, the state has done planning, but that planning had huge gaps. It wasn't comprehensive. There are areas that need to be zeroed in on way more. So this would actually build upon that plan. The plan was solid, but it was not perfect. So we would be building on gaps within the state plan. And that's great to say in a project narrative. You should bring up that type of information to help the reviewers when they're reading what you've written, help them dispel any concerns that it would be duplicative. What you can also do in a letter of support is to go to that state agency and have them write a letter and say, not only do we support this project, but it also builds upon previous state planning. It helps to advance state priorities, and it's not duplicative, right? It takes the baton from the plan that we've done and brings it to the next point in the relay. So you can use letters of support in that way to help demonstrate, who is bought into the project, to help dispel any concerns that you might have, and to bring people to the table who might not otherwise be engaged, but would really benefit from being engaged on the project. So all letters of support that you're working on, again, of course, have to be project specific. So you want to make sure it's not just a generic template that really has nothing to do with the fund or the project. You've got to make it specific. They should come from all parties that are relevant to your project. So we already talked about this. Partners, if the project is happening on private land, whether that's a homeowner, a business owner, a private foundation, you will need a letter of support from that landowner to ensure that NFWF understands this project has been thought through, you've engaged the landowner, and everybody's okay with this moving forward. If you're an NGO, a non-governmental organization, a statewide or a regional nonprofit, it probably makes sense to have the governments come to the table. So I would say the municipality, if you're working in a state that has pretty active counties, the county, the state itself, and maybe even the federal entities, Army Corps of Engineers or USDA, whoever it might be. On the flip side, if you're coming from a governmental perspective, you may want to engage your local nonprofits and your community-based organizations to show that you've got buy-in outside of government support. So all of those folks should be coming together for letters of support. It should be on letterhead from whichever organization it's coming from, signed, and of course, don't forget to upload them. One of the last things to cover here is submitting to Easy Grants. So we talked a bit about this already. Easy Grants is NFWF's grant platform. There's an entire help desk for technical issues. So I'm not going to go into any of the tech issues right now, but if and when you run into those challenges, you should contact the help desk. And that's why Joanne said earlier, you want to get started early so that if you have technical issues, you're not waiting until 11:59 on the night that it's due when the help desk is no longer there. But some pro tips are to save your progress frequently. Timeouts just happen. You'll get logged out for no reason. This happened 2 sessions ago while Sally was presenting. I had another window open with the slide deck just in case, and it said I was logged out of my Google account. And, if I had been using that tab, the slides would have gone down and we would have had to start over. So it happens at random times. So just make sure you're saving frequently. You want to upload all of your required attachments. Again, letters of support, maps, those have a separate upload tab. And then, of course, you want to double check for errors, especially in those fields that are required with the asterisk to make sure that you've got everything you're on the hook for. So I'm going to take the slides down here. We're going to have a couple minutes for Q&A, and then we are going to go into our mock proposal exercise, which is really meant to take everything you've heard from us throughout the day and apply that to actually evaluating a futures fund proposal or a fake one that we've come up with. But before we do that, I'm going to take these down and see what we have for questions here. Comment in the chat. Yeah, this is obviously important to discuss. So the impacts of AI on the environment, it's not for everything, right? If you're doing a Google search, what are the towns in X county? That is not the right use for AI. If you're deciding to use it, you would want to be leaning towards some of the more advanced uses for it. It's nonsensical, at least in my personal opinion, to use it for things that a simple Google search will have covered. It's just really, the juice is not worth the squeeze at all. Lauren?
Can I ask a question about the co-op?
Yeah, please.
This was by far the most confusing part of the application for me last year. It was my first time doing it. So I mean, I get if you're going out and doing surveys and education and like that, that's a very clear reason to have a co-op. I was going to do like engineering work, and we're collecting survey data and some soil data. And so I was like, technically it's data collection, but it's not really anything we're sharing publicly. But I couldn't, the directions didn't seem clear enough for me to figure out that distinction on my own. And I asked some questions and I couldn't quite get a clear answer. So I don't know if you could just kind of go over when a co-op is needed and, in what situations we should include that in our budget, and just kind of anything about the co-op to clear that up.
Yeah, I'm surprised that it took this long to get to a co-op question. So for those who don't know, I'm forgetting the second or the first P in the acronym, but it's the Quality Assurance, maybe Protection, Victoria, is that right?
Project plan.
Project plan, Quality Assurance Project Plan. So this is a plan that's required because this is EPA funding. It's a plan that's required by EPA when there is data collection that's used for decision making. So those are the operative words there, data that is used for decision making. If there is data collection that's happening over the course of a project that is meant to inform students about the scientific method, or really just gathering data without really an intent to use that to prioritize future project sites or make decisions, a co-op is not needed. If you're using it for decision making, though, to cite projects down the road, to actually decide what is moving forward towards implementation, when it starts to be made for or used for decision making, that's when a co-op is triggered. And so then you'd be required to complete this co-op plan. For those who have not completed a co-op before, it's a little burdensome. It's definitely been challenging for folks. So with that, there's a couple things that NFWF has done to try to alleviate some of that pain. There are dedicated co-op technical assistance providers at NFWF who know much more about the plans than we do. So if you have questions, we can point you right in their direction. But there is technical assistance at NFWF that's familiar with this program that can help you make that connection and help you work through a co-op. There are webinars and online resources that NFWF has put forward tied to the Futures Fund to support folks who are going through a co-op. And then on top of that, Lauren said, when can you add that to the budget? If you have a co-op and if that's triggered on your project, you can apply it to the budget. It's really as simple as that. If you have to do one, you can build that into your budget, so you're not doing that on your own dime. If you don't have to do a co-op, you don't need to worry about it. But if it is required as part of your project, you're allowed to build that in your budget. And Joanne mentioned that briefly earlier. If this is something you're required to do, account for it. Don't make this an expense that you have to absorb as an organization. It's part of the plan. It's required for EPA funding. So you might as well add it in.
Follow up. Would those technical providers give some sort of amount of time, or how long it takes to develop a co-op to put into the budget?
Yeah, I think they could give you a good sense of, generally what the expected time frame is. I would, if it were me, I would also do what Joanne said, maybe round up a little bit just to give yourself that buffer, because they can be challenging. But yeah, they'll have a good sense of what an average co-op, what the timeline looks like. And then if there are any specific complications with your project, they would help you work through that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, and I can just quickly chime in to just kind of give like a rough estimate that we give to folks, which is that when you submit a co-op draft, Stantec, our co-op technical assistants, take 30 days to complete their initial review. And then when it's submitted to EPA for review, that can take up to 60 days. So that's kind of just a rough sense of giving yourself that cushion time of the review.
That's a good question. Like I said, I'm surprised that didn't come up earlier. Well, I think, Joanne, did you have something?
Yeah, just Lauren, if you're done with your question, if you had others, I just wanted to make a quick point. not on quaps. Lauren, did you have anything else? Okay, you're good. Kyle, when you were talking about letters of support, I wrote a little note to myself to just bring this up because we've seen this. Like Kyle said, people don't always, they attach the letter, but it's not signed. Or people put a draft, um, like they have this great budget, this great project, and then you go to the letters of support and they do get read. Every single letter gets read. And they use, maybe you use a template and you give it to somebody you're working with to give you guidance, and they just simply sign it, and all your letters of support are looking the same. And that is not good. That doesn't help anyone. So, this is your chance to use letters of support to say more about your project and things you want to do. So, don't disregard the value of letters of support. So that was all I just wanted to say.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Joanne. I see it as free space. I mean, it's not part of the narrative and it's not viewed the same way, but if you can have your town and your state and a nonprofit that's highly respected coming in and saying, here's why we like this project and here are the specific reasons, why wouldn't you use that, to your advantage rather than just a cut and paste template?
That's right. And sometimes people forget that key partners really need to have that letter in there.
Yeah.
So, you're having all these other groups, but not the key partners involved. Why? That's what the reviewer is going to ask. Why? So.
All very good points. So I'm going to move us along here. We're going to go next into this interactive exercise. So we'll be going through a mock proposal, and then this is the last exercise we'll have before breakout rooms. So I'm going to run you through how this will work. We're going to primarily use the chat here. So I would just say pop open the chat window while I'm going through the instructions here, because we will want some engagement from folks. So this is a mock proposal that we drafted internally based off of our insights at Throwe Environmental as field liaisons for this program. So this is not taken from any proposal that has been submitted in the past. Of course, it's informed by proposals, but that's dozens of them, if not hundreds. So it's a simplified version of what a proposal might look like. And the intent is to help you break down the components of a proposal. So we're going to go through and we're going to highlight common errors that we're seeing. Red flags, yellow flags, green flags, positive, negative, neutral, to help us decide, what's sticking out. And the purpose is to help you all as attendees practice identifying issues that come up in a proposal. And we're really building off of the knowledge that was kind of shared earlier through all of these sessions when we're talking about budget and copy editing and narratives. So we're going to show you, it'll be 2 slides and we'll have 4 little activities here. So the first slide in each set will show you the mock proposal as is. And I'll ask folks in the chat to comment what they think is beneficial, maybe not beneficial, or just, you need more information. So we'll go through and talk about where your red, yellow, and green flags are. And then I will reveal what, at least as the field liaison team, we've determined to be red, yellow, or green flags, and we can talk through them. So hopefully that'll make more sense in a second when you see it. But all I'm going to need from folks is once I go to the next slide, we'll talk through what you see on screen. I want your feedback in the chat, and then I will kind of reveal what was intended for you after that. So let's start with the first exercise here. The mock proposal here is titled Watershed Planning for Nitrogen Reduction Across 6 Municipalities on the Winding River. The request is for $508,000. And the match is $330,000, so that's more than 50%. The grant period is from January 2026 through February 2028. The lead applicant is called KG Consulting, and there are letters of support, 1 each, from either a town manager, council, a select board, or a planning department from one of those 6 municipalities, so 6 letters in total. And the project, just high level, is described as a project that will seek to reduce nitrogen loading downstream to Long Island Sound by conducting watershed-based planning in 6 municipalities in Nutmeg County, Connecticut, and Bay County, Massachusetts, along the Winding River. The project will engage community-based organizations, municipal leaders, and state officials. It builds upon watershed-based planning done in Nutmeg and Bay County in 2024-2023. Again, the lead applicant is KG Consulting, with all 6 municipalities as project partners. The project will develop watershed plans for each county that identified nature-based projects for future implementation, which will be prioritized by highest relative nitrogen reduction. 4 towns have elderly populations higher than the state average, and 3 towns have poverty levels below state average. So meant to be a very quick overview here. So what I'm going to ask folks to do now is in the chat, you can just put something as simple as red flag is or green flag is. And red flag is obviously something that maybe stands out in a negative way for you. Green is something that's positive, and a yellow flag would be kind of neutral. But in the chat, just based on what you see on screen, feel free to start typing in some things here that you feel stick out as red, yellow, or green flags. And as folks start to type too, if anyone wants to come off of mute, you can also feel free to do that. Okay, so someone says red flag, the description is too long. Okay. And we'll talk through all of these in the next slide here. Title, yellow flag could be more descriptive. Okay. Yeah, maybe we'll actually go through these as we go. So the description here, yeah, I think in terms of like a quick, once over or an abstract or something, there's a lot of information built in here. Yep, so maybe that could be shorter. Yellow flag, more descriptive. Yeah, I think going back to what Sally started us with, as specific as possible. I like this one from Kate. We need letters of support from other municipalities. Interesting. So we've only got letters from the folks that are actually, the projects are happening in their area. What about others? Where are our partner organizations? We have one that says KG Consulting is listed as the lead applicant. That's one of them. That's right on the nose. You cannot have a consultant as an applicant for the Futures Fund. It has to be a municipality or a nonprofit or a non-governmental organization. Match is a red flag, quite high for the reimbursable amount. So that's not necessarily, we'll get there. We're going to break down the match in a couple of slides. That amount is just fine, the 330,000. It's okay to be above 50%. But as we move forward, let's see where the match is coming from. Red flag is no elaboration about elderly or poverty statistics and relevance to the proposal. Probably shouldn't even be included here. Yeah, it kind of sticks out. We'll see more why that's relevant in the exercise later on, but I agree here, it really doesn't have anything to do with the project. Green flags, enough funding, good, lots of letters of support, yep. Yellow flag is more details on what types of projects will be considered. Agreed, we're just saying nature-based solutions. There's no specification. And then red flag is the grant period exceeds 2 years limit. That's correct. You got me on that one. So why don't I reveal what I had here for everyone? So we already highlighted several of these. The red flag is that the grant period is too long. It has to be 2 years maximum, and this is just over 2. It's about a month and a half over 2 years. So the project period is too long, and that would immediately get flagged by NFWF. Another red flag is the lead applicant. It cannot be a consultant, so that would be flagged, and we have that come up twice. The request amount, I don't believe anybody said this, but this is over the allowed amount for a planning proposal in this fund. The maximum is 500,000, so we're just a little bit over that. So think about that with the conversation that we had earlier. NFWF will not go back proposal by proposal and say, hey, you're a little over, why don't you, revise downwards? You don't really have that opportunity. So make sure you're checking what the minimum and maximum is, because $8,000 there is the difference that would, at least on this one, be an automatic decline. What we like about this in the green is that it's watershed planning, which is a typical NFWF project for this fund, which is good. We're engaging 6 municipalities across multiple states and counties. So that's good in terms of transferability and scale. We've got match that's more than 50%, despite the fact that the request is too high, but it's still over 50%. So that total number is good. Like I said, we're going to break that down. And later on, once we identify nature-based solutions, even though there's not enough information on those solutions now, they're going to be prioritized by highest relative nitrogen reduction. So those are all good signs. Some information that we need more, or where we need more detail. We've got a letter of support from each town, but what about the other project partners? And a couple people flagged that. We also hear that the project builds on watershed planning done in these two counties in 24 and 23. My first question there is, why the heck are we doing more planning then? If it was just done last year and the year before, what's the point for more watershed-based planning? So what we would ask there, or maybe a comment that a reviewer would leave, is, can you provide more information as to how this isn't redundant? So all things to consider here that we'll continue to unpack in the next few exercises. So the next one for you is focused on match. Again, so this is all fake information. We've got the 6 towns from each state, or the 3 from each state, and we have what type of match that they have, the source of the funding, the amount, the status, and the details. Don't worry about the math adding up. It adds up to 330, so don't spend too much time on that. But what you'll want to spend time on are some of the details here. So the first town here, West Grantsboro, is providing cash match from their general fund for $55,000. That money is cash on hand, and they are funds that are committed by the town council. The second one is from East Grantsboro, cash match that's coming from American Rescue Plan funding, $100,000 cash on hand, and it's leftover ARPA money that has been set aside, and it's going to expire by the end of the fiscal year. So they want to use that for match on the grant. The third one here is from Moneyberg. This is volunteer time that they're using. They're valuing it at 10 grand. It's pledged, and that money is, or the amount of volunteer time is valued based on previous year volunteer estimates. So they're using information they already have. Number 4 here is from Catchville. Staff time from the planning department valued at $40,000. It's pledged, and this is equivalent to 2 full-time employees at 25% staff time. Number 5 is from Fundington, cash match from the state. It's $120,000. They intend to apply for this funding, and it will be an application to a state water quality program. And the last one is from PayMe. It's cash match from a philanthropic grant, $5 grand. They've already applied for this funding, and it's an application to a local family foundation. So a lot of specific information here. But again, same type of exercise if you want to put in the chat, or feel free to unmute any green, yellow, or red flags that you're seeing that are cause for concern, or maybe something that you're looking favorably on. All right, we've got our first one here from Charles. Red flag, federal funds can't be used as match. Correct. So this has happened multiple times over the past few years. We have seen American Rescue Plan Act money come in as match on one of these grants. And even though that is pretty much restricted, it's unrestricted money that every municipality was getting, or most municipalities were getting, it's still considered federal in origination. So American Rescue Plan money cannot be used. It is considered federal. So that would not be eligible. And Charles, you make a very good point and a good catch on that one. Even though it's flexible at the local level, that's federal. So that's a big red flag here. 100 grand of the community or the proposal's match is now off the table. Another good one from Kate. Intend to apply is not strong, and it's a large amount. Exactly. So this is, that they intend to apply to a Massachusetts grant. That really doesn't mean much to me. It's great that they highlighted it and they identified where they might go for funding or match. But now we've identified 220 grand of their proposed match. That's really not very strong. Give folks another minute or two here. Yes, green flag, general funds committed by the town council. That's a fantastic one. That's a huge green flag. That money's already been committed. It's a pretty substantial amount, 55 grand, and it's cash. So that money is on hand, they're ready to go with it, and that shows direct buy-in from the town. All right, for the sake of time here, I'm going to click ahead while folks keep typing, and we already hit several of these. So money from the town is good. American Rescue Plan money, not good. That could be considered federal leverage, but it is not considered match. A good sign on the volunteer time is that they're basing this off of previous year volunteer estimates. So 10 grand's a little high, but I think that's a good thing if they're grounding this in data, and we don't know what type of volunteer efforts they're doing. The staff time is pledged, so that's good. That's really as far as you can go with staff time, but we've got that in the hopper. We talked about intent to apply, and then the last one for the philanthropic grant is money that's applied to at a family foundation. I like the fact that this is local, that's showing local buy-in, and they've already submitted an application. All right, we've got 2 more activities here. So the first one goes to their project narrative. So this is meant to build off of Sally's session earlier. So we've got the project is applying to the Clean Water and Healthy Watersheds theme, as well as the Sustainable and Resilient Communities theme. So remember, those are the Long Island Sound Futures Fund project themes. And then here is what they've got for a problem and a proposed solution. So the problem says, due to recent extreme flooding and storm events, long-term erosion challenges, and ongoing non-point source pollution, the 6 communities in Nutmeg and Bay counties have been identified through statewide planning as high priority geographies for resilience projects and nutrient risk reduction, with estimated downstream impacts to Long Island Sound classified as moderately to highly significant. The proposed project then will take a systems-based approach, conducting watershed-based planning across 6 towns in the Winding River watershed to assess future nature-based opportunities to reduce nutrient loading and enhance community resilience to water quantity-based hazards like flooding and extreme rain events. So same thing here, we are highlighting positive, negative, and neutral through red, yellow, and green flags. And there's a lot of specific information here. So good on you all for catching the flag so far. I think you've done a really solid job at this. It's meant to be specific because this is the type of detail that reviewers are looking at when they see proposals. And this is likely kind of equivalent to the level of detail that you'd be providing. So even though it's specific, it's meant to be that way. Good one. So Charles says, Massachusetts is not coastal for the Futures Fund and can't apply for sustainable and resilient communities. So you're mostly right there, Charles, just a little nuance. So it's not that coastal communities are eligible for sustainable and resilient communities as a theme. It's actually the entire state of Connecticut and New York. So any portion in those states that are in the Futures Fund boundary. But the sentiment that you're getting at is right. Massachusetts can't apply for that theme. So as a project, this project isn't eligible for that one. It's, just because we cross state boundaries, that whole project does not become eligible for a resilience proposal. Give folks another minute or 2 here, see what they're thinking. All right, we've got one more. Enhance community resilience to water quantity-based hazards, which is not the focus of the Futures Fund. Good job, Lauren. Okay, so I'm going to reveal these here. That's really what we were getting at with this one. It had to do with themes. So you both, Charles and Lauren, you both nailed this. So let me move my chat out of the way here. You're not allowed to apply for 2 themes. So automatically the selection of multiple themes was not a good thing. You're really only supposed to apply for one of those. And what we talked about is that sustainable and resilient communities is not eligible in the state of Massachusetts. So that's a problem. And that is a red flag. That would automatically be an issue with the application. A ton of green here. We're talking about benefits to water quality and water quantity issues. So the erosion, the non-point source pollution, and even the flooding and the storm events, those are good things. But the resilience projects, the reason I highlight them in yellow is because that should be supplemental detail for this proposal. It should not be a core aspect of it. And because this person applied for the Sustainable and Resilient Communities theme, they made that kind of the foundation of what they were applying for. And we already decided that's just not applicable. They can't do that. So all of that information is good, and it's okay if a nitrogen reduction project has other benefits. They're all going to, right? A green infrastructure project that pulls out nitrogen is also going to have community greening and community beautification, maybe economic benefits, maybe even public access and recreation benefits. Those are all important, but they've got to be viewed as separate or secondary to the main thing for the Futures Fund for this theme, which is the water quality and the nutrient reduction. So all of that information is fine in and of itself, but when it starts to be part of this theme that they're not eligible for, that becomes the big problem. Okay, one more here, and then we will go into breakout rooms after this activity. So this is our last piece of the narrative here. So we've got information on the applicant, the technical merit of the project, and the work plan and timeline. So the applicant qualifications say, while none of the towns have managed large grants before, KG Consulting has worked on one Futures Fund grant and 2 other NFWF grants in the past. The project will also engage the Winding River Conservancy, which has implemented streamlined buffers under a previous Futures Fund grant for project management and overall plan development. So in terms of technical merit, the Winding River Conservancy and the consultant will leverage several decades of planning and project implementation for plan development. The consultant will leverage 15 years of design build experience for implementation of high priority nature-based projects in year 2. For the work plan and the timeline, the towns are going to contract all of the planning to the consultant, and they'll each hold 1 virtual town meeting. In months 0 through 8 of this 2-year project, initial planning is going to happen across all towns. 9 through 11, the project prioritization and development of high project concepts. So this is where they will be prioritizing projects. Month 12 will be community engagement, and then 13 through 14 will be design, engineering, permitting, and implementation. So we'll give folks a few minutes here to identify red, yellow, and green flags. I actually just found 1 or 2 more that I didn't realize I put in there. So that's always fun. And we will go through some of these. And again, if it's too much to type, you can always feel free to come off mute.
Green flag that there's some experience with previous grants for their qualifications.
Yep. Yeah, good one, Chris. I think that actually helps address in the first sentence, none of the towns have managed large grants. So that would otherwise be a red flag. And I think on the next slide, you'll see that's highlighted as yellow, but we identify later on that the consultant and the NGO do have time or do have experience on that. Anyone else before we go to the next one? Yep, we've got red flag, project repetition. Yep, simple typo, but that's in there. It's something small, but you caught it, so that shows something. Red flag, implementation is not part of this planning grant. Community engagement comes after project prioritization, and NGO should be the applicant with the consultant not being the applicant. Yeah, all of those are right. So implementation, this is a planning grant. We can't do planning, design, and build all under the same grant like we talked about. Community engagement comes way too late, and it's only a month long. That's really not enough time for 6 towns. That's a big geography. And then the last piece here, we already talked about the consultant can't be the lead. Yep, and Kate said, shouldn't community engagement come sooner? So let's kind of click these on here. So we already talked about this one, the yellow. None of the towns have managed large grants, but we do make up for that with the consultant and the conservancy. They both have experience here. I didn't highlight it, but a flag for me here was that this conservancy is just mentioned for the first time. There's no information about letters of support or match. So that's a great place to come in with more match, especially knowing that the ARPA money and the state grant are not really that strong. So I would ask them, why do they not have that conservancy more engaged? It's great that they're bringing expertise to the table, but I think there's a place to engage them more. We talked about typo. We talked about design build not being strong for this program. That's just not something they like to fund. Contracting all planning to the consultant. It's not a red flag, but it's a little cause for concern. Really, all of this budget you can then imagine is kind of being funneled towards the consultant with very little time spent with town engagement. Yes, the town has letters of support, but now I'm really starting to question how engaged the towns are. So obviously, this is a simplified version of a proposal, but that would be something that I'm looking for throughout my whole review. Like, do these towns, are they really bought in, or is the consultant kind of just pushing this for themselves? A red flag that I did not hear people catch was that the towns will host one virtual town meeting each. So this goes back to the information about the town population. We heard that they were elderly, and we heard that there was a high poverty rate. So one virtual town meeting is probably not the best approach for both of those populations. Elderly populations, we've seen a lot of applications come in and talk about phone surveys and doing things online. It's just not the best format for engagement when you have a high number of elderly individuals in your population. So that's probably not matched up well with the community that you're serving. And then the high poverty rate, there's definite extrapolation here, but you could make the argument that high poverty rate may mean that folks are working multiple jobs. And if that's the case, trying to get them to a town meeting, virtual or not, really is a lot to ask and really isn't that effective. And now the community engagement's coming after the prioritization. That tends to be a problem. The last thing here is we're prioritizing projects. And we say this in months 9 through 11. There's got to be data that's collected to help with that prioritization. There's no mention of a QAP. So that's another area where we probably would need to have a QAP completed if we're going to be prioritizing projects for future implementation. So we already went through all of this, so I won't spend really much time on this slide at all. But really solid identification from everybody. I think you hit probably 85 or 90% of what was on there. Red flags focused a lot on the match itself. It wasn't exactly where it needed to be. The request was too high. The match, certain portions of it weren't very strong, or were just null and void in the first place. The consultant was a big issue as the lead. Community engagement wasn't great. And of course, they were too broad with the design build piece, and they were going across multiple themes. So all of that was just totally in conflict with fundamental portions of the Futures Fund. Kind of in the middle that we needed more information on, we didn't know, like, is this planning actually duplicative? Is it adding anything new, or is this just planning for the sake of planning? We're still have open-ended questions about the town's capacity and their role. We don't have enough letters of support. There was nothing from that conservancy, the county, the state. All the planning went right to the contractor, so that's a little confusing. And we talked about match already. And then on the positive side, the project idea, it really fit within the Futures Fund. It was watershed-based planning focused on nitrogen. And I even liked the co-benefits for resilience when they weren't part of that project theme. The scale was good, 6 towns, 2 states, 2 counties. Even though some of the match was off limits, the diversity of match was actually pretty good. Every town came to the table with match, and they were different sources, even if we said some of them weren't a great fit. And it does tee up future implementation prioritized by nitrogen, so that's a good thing. The problem and solution felt like they meshed well, and technical merit was pretty high with highly qualified organizations. So a lot of information we threw at you. That was kind of the point. And I think everyone did a really good job of identifying some of those things. So hopefully when you start to write yours, you can look for things like that and think about it critically like a reviewer would. And if you see some of those red and yellow flags come up, you can address them. And if you see the green flags, you can keep sprinkling them in throughout. That tends to make a proposal stronger. So I think what we'll do now is Chris is going to tee us up for a survey that folks are going to do after the workshop, and then breakout rooms, and then we will go right into those rooms. So Chris.
Okay. Hi, everyone. before we get into the breakout rooms, I want to thank everyone for their time and attention and participation so far. Just wanted to share some details with you, some information before we split up. We've created an attendee survey. We hope this has been helpful to you. We hope the breakouts will be only more helpful for you, and the conversation does not need to stop with this workshop. We'll be sharing some contact information with you on the next slide. But in the chat, I'm going to be placing this survey link. You can also take a picture of the QR code. But please, as soon as it's convenient for you, give us some feedback. We want to be able to make this programming as useful as possible to you, and your feedback is critical to doing that. So take a look in the chat. Kyle, next slide, please. Here are some details for follow-up after the workshop. We're sharing our Field Liaison team state leads contact information with you, also in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to the contact in your state of interest, or you can also reach us at LISFF at Throwe Environmental, also in the chat. Also wanted to point out, you can book a NFWF proposal lab with Victoria and her team. The link is also in the chat. You'll simply go to the booking site and sign up for a half-an-hour meeting to discuss your proposal and get some feedback. Next slide. Okay, breakout rooms. So you are going to be assigned to one of two breakout rooms. It says that you'll be prompted to join, but I think it will happen automatically as soon as I open the rooms. Each room is going to have two of our field liaisons as facilitators. You guys will have the opportunity to talk more about your specific proposal ideas, get some feedback from your peers, and discuss potential improvements with the peers and facilitators. You do not need to return to the main room. You'll be wrapping up in your respective breakout rooms. I'll be visiting the rooms around the time we're scheduled to end, but there is not a hard stop. If you're having a free-flowing conversation, the facilitators will chat with you as long as it's reasonable. And just remember, all the contact information to follow up after is available to you. We are recording, and we'll be sharing the recording and the slides afterwards. So with that, I'm going to open the rooms, and I'll be checking in to make sure everything is going smoothly. Thanks, everyone.